pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, I will call this meeting of the Milton Planning Commission to order. It is 7:03 according to my watch. I don't know whether that's right or not. Given the fact that there's no public here, I think I will dispense with all the preliminary readings and ask for a motion that public comment be closed.
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Unanimous. Robin, do you want to call the first item? Oh, we're just action minutes. Sorry, we've got two sets of minutes to approve. One was from the minutes of March 27th meeting. Were there any proposed changes or corrections?
We don't have them.
Just saying, you don't have them.
I thought you said.
I said I was planning to send them to you.
Oh, I thought you did send them out. I'm sorry.
Unless
Okay,
I
we
did
don't
it
have
in my
either one
sleep,
actually.
and I
Do
forgot
we?
I did it, but
Sorry about that.
No, that was just saying
Okay.
I don't have minutes available, so I again apologize for that.
Then why don't you? Let's just go ahead and.
We defer this.
Second.
So you want to make? So you made a motion to defer in second. I heard over here.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, that's fine.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay. Call the first item, Rob,
Okay.
please.
Okay, the first item is discussion of crabapple form-based code and TDR presented by Caleb Rakico and TSW and Rick Fruits. So we'll just let them start.
Thank you. Good evening. As Robin mentioned, my name is Caleb Rakico. I am a partner or principal with the firm of TSW. The clicker.
It's up there.
It's up there. Can you grab it, Rick? For about 4 to 5 months, we have been working with the City of Milton on preparing a form-based code for the crabapple area. What I wanted to do tonight was to give you an overview of the code, talk a little bit about the process and what it's hoped to achieve, and then hopefully answer any questions that you may have, assuming you've had sufficient time to review the document. As a lot of you may know, form-based codes are a new type of zoning that a lot of communities are looking at as a way to shape growth and ensure that the character of the community is provided. I think it's Robin's. The image before you shows really what form-based coding is all about. It's an example of two different CVS pharmacies, which from a zoning perspective can be seen as very similar. They're both 14,000 square feet. They both have 4 parking spaces per 1,000. They're both brick. But when you look beyond the simple use, their forms are very different. The one on the one side is a very conventional Anywhere USA CVS, as where the one on the right is more of a walkable, pedestrian-friendly model, even though they both show as red or commercial on a land use map. These two stores really hit at what the point of form-based coding is. It is a type of zoning regulation that places the form and design of the building first and foremost, followed by use, and then followed by administration. That's very different. Yes, George?
I just want to interrupt you for a second. Has anybody here not heard or seen Caleb's presentation?
I have not.
You have not? Okay. I just wanted to make sure. Sorry. Go ahead. I didn't want you to have to go through it yet again.
Versus conventional zoning, which again is about use, administration, and form. Form-based coding, again, is about defining a specific result, a specific kind of community you want to be. It is a regulation, meaning it is not a guideline, so it is in fact backed by the power of the local authority to regulate zoning through public health, safety, and welfare considerations. Unlike conventional zoning, it tends to be provided in both written and graphic format. So the form-based code that you've seen for crabapple has a lot of pictures. These are very important to understanding what the code is about, but again, they're always backed up by text, which is key. And form-based codes are also very closely related to community-based planning efforts. One of the ways that is accomplished is through what is called a regulating plan. A regulating plan is essentially a document or a map that takes a community-based vision, as you see on the left here, and converts it into a simplified zoning diagram that identifies streets, public spaces, and the like. As we think about crabapple, there were a lot of things that were emerging from the 2008 crabapple visioning process that really do lend themselves quite well to a regulating plan. These include things like public streets, developer and private built streets, public spaces, greenway trails, intensity zones, and the preservation of a certain amount of agricultural land. Now, form-based codes, as I mentioned, have been used for about the past decade throughout the Atlanta region. The images before you are in downtown Woodstock, where we prepared a form-based code about 8 or 9 years ago. You can see some of the housing that was built. You can tell just from looking at the code that there's a strong attention to architectural character, architectural identity, meaning what makes Woodstock Woodstock, the design of public spaces, ranging from a small community green to a more urban town center environment. Form-based codes have also been used in Lawrenceville, where, again, we prepared a form-based code that guided the first new mixed-use development in downtown Lawrenceville in nearly 100 years. Or even in the Lindbergh-MARTA station of Atlanta, where townhomes with stoops, porches, and local architectural character were provided. And certainly, form-based codes are also more conventionally used in what we know or what we hear of as new urbanist new towns, meaning developments such as this in Baldwin Park near Orlando, which strive to recreate the traditional town environment with a mix of uses, sidewalks, pedestrian-friendly streets, and architecture, again, that is truly architecture of place. And I'd like to end with one of the earliest examples of form-based coding from Manchester Center, Vermont, a community which, starting in the late 70s, early 1980s, started to experience a lot of growth pressure from outlet malls because they're near the ski resorts. A form-based code was implemented in Manchester. The buildings on the left, the first three, are buildings that emerged from that code. They happen to be retail stores today, two-floor retail stores, but the code had them be designed in such a way that they looked like the vernacular character of Manchester Center. And so these just represent the range of environmental settings within which form-based code can apply. Now, how do we make form-based codes work in the Crabapple area? Well, when we started this process, we had a series of interviews with key stakeholders in the community. We had a stakeholder committee of which George was a representative on, and we tried to get an understanding from the people who have been working with the Crabapple Code, what were the key concerns about it. We heard a couple of very resounding trends, one being that the code was very complex. You had underlying zoning, you had a series of overlays, and then you had those overlays tied to a master planning document. And you also had a series of unofficial use limits that were really the remnants from when that was part of Fulton County. From those interviews and from that stakeholder committee meeting, we identified several key objectives of the Crabapple Code. One would be to, of course, codify the vision emerging from the 2008 visioning study. Another would be to prepare a code that simplified the process in a way that protected existing neighborhoods, at the same time creating certainty for developers and flexibility, and then very importantly, a couple of statutory considerations. We wanted to make sure that we avoided downzoning property and incorporated transfer development rights, as Rick will talk about shortly. We also were tasked with taking that and preparing it using the SMART code as a model template. The SMART code is a type of form-based code that is essentially free for communities to use. It is based on this idea of a rural to urban transect, which sounds complicated, but basically says that all communities fall somewhere in a gradient from complete wilderness to completely urban. And so we needed to define what those meant. And very importantly, use that SMART code template in a way that calibrated it to the specific needs of Crabapple. So we worked on that, and the proposal or the plan I'm about to present to you tonight is the third draft of that form-based code. It's something that's emerged from the community input through the stakeholders, through a series of public open houses that we've had, from a series of specific comments from property owners in the area, and then, of course, from the review of the City of Milton staff, both planning and community development, public works, even Parks and Recreation have looked at this. So we hope that their feedback is evident. So what does this all mean? Well, Crabapple today has essentially a half dozen to a dozen different zoning districts, ranging from agricultural 1, which is a 1 unit per acre designation, to higher density mixed use around the intersections of Crabapple Road, Birmingham Highway, and Broadwell Road. When we think about how these existing zoning designations tied with the 2008 visioning document relate to the SMART code, we determined very rapidly that there are essentially 4 of the transect zones represented. T2, meaning those areas that are rural, equivalent to AG1, and then T3, T4, and T5, which have varying gradations of urbanism. In addition, after talking with the presidents and representatives from several of the neighborhood groups in the area, we determined that we also needed to create special districts that would essentially incorporate those communities, Kensington Farms, Waterside, Six Hills, into the form-based code area, but not change their underlying zoning. And so those were designated as special districts, meaning that certain design provisions apply, but they're still going to be regulated by their underlying zoning. If you look at the regulating plan, you'll see how all of those ideas that I've talked about start to come together in the Crabapple area. The areas in gray are representative of the special districts, meaning those are areas where the current zoning, be it AG1 or R1 or CUP, is going to continue to apply. The areas of red are civic areas, meaning they're owned by Fulton County, churches, or other entities, and they fall into what civic zones are. The green are AG1 properties, which are essentially analogous to the proposed T2. And then the gradations of purple represent those 3 developed transect zones. T3 being a suburban transect zone, T4 being more of a neighborhood general transect zone, and T5 being the most intense mixed-use transect zone. In addition, this map shows both the existing roadways in the area and the new roadways in the area. It also shows civic spaces, greenway trails, and then has certain specific notations throughout it talking about specific design treatments and streetscape treatments on certain corridors. So from that regulating plan, we also prepared a code that essentially takes that and supports it with the meat of the zoning ordinance that will ensure that it is shaped. Now, the form-based zoning code for Crabapple is essentially divided into 7 sections. And these go from less specific to more specific. So the articles at the beginning apply primarily to how do you use the code, how do you use the regulating plan, and the articles at the bottom, the later articles, get into more detail. The first article, Article 1, is pretty basic. It talks about the general instructions for using the code. It includes a series of policies that relate back to existing City of Milton policies and plans. It talks about how this relates to definitions in other part of the City of Milton zoning code. And then very importantly, it talks about what exactly those transect zones are and what exactly those special districts are, just laying out very briefly what they mean. It then talks about the process. Essentially, one of the key goals of the form-based code is to make it very simple to develop in a manner consistent with the 2008 visioning process and consistent with the form-based code. So what this means is that developments that come in and build consistent with the regulating plan and do not require any variance or warrants will be able to go directly to community development for a permit. Any variations from that would be subject to a new type of variation process called a warrant, which essentially is an administrative variation that says for certain things, for example, changing a setback line to preserve a specimen tree or moving a driveway to prevent from encroaching into a stream buffer, can be handled administratively. Everything else, however, anything more substantial, goes to the Board of Zoning Appeals. It then talks about density. Density is one of those things in this form-based code that is very different from what you're used to. Traditionally, in the City of Milton, you talk about density in terms of setbacks or building height or number of units per acre. We have created a special classification of density for the form-based code area, which we call the building unit. Essentially, the building unit is and amount of stuff or development that you can build per unit. Those generally relate to 1 residential unit per building unit or 2,250 square feet of commercial, office, or civic space. The idea being that some of these transect zones are implicitly very mixed use. And so we wanted to create a mechanism whereby developers could build a building, have the flexibility to change if they build it initially as housing. They could convert it to office or retail at a later time. And then very importantly, tie the density within this area back to the underlying zoning. Now, why is that important? Well, that's important for a couple of reasons. One, if you look at the chart before you, you'll see that there are about 1,230 density or building units in Crabapple under current zoning. The visioning study that was done 3 years ago envisioned about 1,900 building units. And the carrying capacity of that study, which basically means if we kept the 3-floor height limit in the visioning study and we expanded it to more commercial or smaller units or more senior type housing, could go up to about 2,600 units, as where the form-based code is about 1,600. So there's a very important discrepancy here, a very important disconnect. And as I mentioned initially, when we started the planning process, we were told that this form-based code had to incorporate this idea of transfer development rights, essentially creating a mechanism for the city of Milton to transfer density from areas that needed to remain or should remain rural to the Crabapple area. And so we've incorporated that along with a series of other bonuses into this draft form-based code. The density bonuses, which have no relationship to TDR, include density bonuses for things like parking. We were told that there's a strong desire for public parking and decked parking, so developers who build that kind of parking essentially will get a bonus of building units. In addition, there are density essentially bonuses for preserving historic homes. If you preserve some of the designated historic properties in Crabapple, those will not count to your density limitations, again, creating a de facto incentive. And then, of course, as Rick will talk about momentarily, there is a series of transferred development right density bonuses that allow transfer of development from rural areas into Crabapple at the property owner's discretion. Okay, so that's part one. Part two talks about the regulating plan. Essentially, it says, as I mentioned, that development shall build according to this regulating plan. The shall is somewhat loose in that the Director of Community Development can move transect zone lines and roadways by up to 300 feet. Again, we recognize that whatever was in that visioning study is not a developer-specific plan. This gives the city the ability to achieve the intent of the visioning study while at the same time allowing developers a little bit of flexibility, which is important. If a developer, however, cannot build according to this plan, the code gives them the ability to file what is called an infill regulating plan, which is essentially a rezoning process. If they had a property, for example, that was designated T2 or T3, and they didn't want to buy TDRs to increase the density, and they didn't want to use any of the other bonuses, they still have the right to go before the Planning Commission and City Council to change that through this infill regulating plan process. Once that is done, that regulating plan will talk about things like the allocation of transect zones, the locations of public civic spaces, and any other specific requirements. In addition, Article 2 talks about the relationship between this form-based code and existing land buffer requirements. We've kept all existing City of Milton buffer requirements between the form-based code area and the existing neighborhoods as part of this proposed code. Article 3 talks about what are the public infrastructure components that will be provided by all new development as part of this code. It includes instructions that basically say, regardless of whether you're developing a 20-acre property or just building a single lot on one of the major corridors, there are streetscape requirements that you have to put in place as part of that. There are provisions for the design of public streets and thoroughfares subject to the Department of Public Works approval, and there are provisions for providing rear alleys in certain parts of the form-based code area. This part of the code also talks about vehicular lane widths and roadway standards. Again, these are all subject to the approval of Public Works, but it gives developers a much broader range of street types that they have the option to use if Public Works feels comfortable with it. It talks about bicycle facilities, creating very specific standards that tie back to the Park and Rec plan and the Comprehensive Transportation Plan. And then very importantly, it talks about the idea of public frontages, essentially what kind of streetscape is required on what streets, both new and existing. And then the final part of Article 3 talks about civic zones. Civic zones are essentially analogous to open space or public space. This form-based code is very different from your current zoning regulations because it takes the requirement for public spaces and lowers it to 5%. I think it's currently 20% in this area. But what it does as part of that trade-off is it gets extremely detailed into what that civic space has to be. It defines specifically what a park is, what a playground is, what a square is, what a green is. Essentially, the idea being that whatever public space is provided, again, per the visioning study, will have to be extremely high quality, usable public space. And things like unused buffers or islands in the parking lots will not count towards public space requirements. So within Crabapple, those things are all going to continue to be required per the tree code and other codes, but we're going to have a very specific set of standards relating to the design of public spaces. Finally, Article 4 gets into the part of the code that most people think about when they think of zoning. What happens on the lot and the building? Within this area, it talks about submittal requirements. Again, assuming that you're compliant with the regulating plan and you're putting in all of your civic space improvements, it talks about what happens within those properties, reverting to existing zoning in the special districts, and then giving specific standards for the new transect zones. It also talks quite a bit about nonconformities. Essentially, anything there today that is inconsistent with this code is going to be grandfathered, as we know. And then it talks about special requirements that City Council or the Planning Commission or a developer may put on the planning area. The second part, the fourth part of this article then talks about the placement of buildings. We still continue to have setbacks. We still continue to have front and rear and side setbacks, but we also have specific characterizations of how those can occur in this code. It talks about lot coverage, and again, it talks about warrants for relief of any of those conditions based on preserving existing trees or other unique features. It then talks about building form, essentially mandating that buildings shall have a simple rectangular form. Again, that was what was in the previous zoning for the area, and that was something in the visioning process. It talks about maximum building sizes. Essentially, it says that you can build a building up to 25,000 square feet, again, per current zoning, but a provision has been created in there that if a grocery store is coming into Crabapple, you can increase to 50,000, which is one of the things the stakeholders told us they wanted. And again, it also talks about, in a lot of detail, the relationship between the building and the street. Again, public space is so important to a form-based code. And then finally, after all that, you get into building function. Building function talks about things like where can you do retail, where can you do single family, where can you do duplexes, where can you do townhomes. Those are all defined by the specific transect zone, with the T2 being the most restrictive, the T5 being the most permissive. Generally speaking, these fall into 4 categories: prohibited, meaning you can't do certain things in certain districts; restricted, meaning you can only do a very little; limited, meaning you can do a bit more; and open. So within the specific districts, T2 provides standards that are analogous to AG1. We've taken the exact setbacks and lot coverage requirements and incorporated those directly into the T2 rural. The T3 suburban district is very analogous to the Brayburn development today, if you're familiar with it. These are homes on bigger lots that may have garages in the front because they're on bigger lots, and they have a density usually of between 3 and with a base of 3 and a maximum of 6 building units per acre with TDR. We then have a T4 district, which talks about what are those standards for the general urban, meaning things like Crabapple Crossings, Crabapple Crossroads, or Crabapple Station. These are areas where the homes are on fairly tiny lots. They tend to have rear alleys. There might be townhomes in there, and there might even be some locations for commercial within there in certain communities. And then we created 2 special subcategories of T4 based on stakeholder input. The first is T4 Open. T4 Open is essentially intended to provide the exact same building type and design standard of T4, meaning small buildings, narrow lots, rear alleys, and 2 to 3 floors, but it applies to those areas in Crabapple which currently have C1 zoning. This is very important because, again, we didn't want to downzone anyone, so we created what was essentially a commercial district that would look like a residential district. And if you know Crabapple, which I'm sure you all do, there are a lot of homes in that community that have exactly this kind of character, and those are indicated at the bottom. And then fairly recently, based on some feedback we received from the homeowners associations at Crabapple Crossings, or Crabapple Station, and Crabapple Crossroads, we also created what is called a T4 restricted zone. This zone essentially only allows residential use. So whereas T4 general will allow you to do home offices, live work, and corner stores in certain conditions, those homeowners associations felt that that was something they did not want in any way, shape, or form because it was prohibited by their bylaws. And so based on the feedback from the stakeholder committee, we created this new category that would be compatible with their current HOA regulations. And then finally, the last transect zone is T5, which is the most urban. It would apply to areas like where the old Blind Dog is, where the buildings are fairly close to the street, where they'll have more shops, more offices, and more retail in general. In this area, the density, again, is a base of 9 building units an acre with an increase available through TDR, as Rick will talk about in a moment. And then Article 4 ends with a lot of your current City of Milton zoning requirements for screening, both of parking and dumpsters, requirements for the location of parking and provisions for shared parking, and requirements for tree planting within your specific parking lots. It also incorporates current landscape standards that exist and provides very general, very limited lighting standards that, again, draw on what is currently within the Crabapple Crossings overlay. And then that part also includes particular standards related to 2 unique building types. One is the drive-through and one is the gas station. One of the things that we heard from the stakeholders, and particularly the residents, is that they want certain types of businesses in this area. But as we all know, things like Starbucks or certain drugstore chains or certain banks require a drive-through before they will go into a community. Recognizing that the residents want certain types of businesses, we created a very specific condition under which those drive-throughs could come into the Crabapple area. Essentially, it says that they can be of a character matching the primary building. They have to be designed in a certain way that the drive-throughs are on the side or the rear, and they really have to apply and follow the architectural standard of the character of the community. The image on the top there is actually a Starbucks that is over in Baxter, South Carolina, but it would be a perfect example for Crabapple. Gas stations were another thing that we had to consider as part of this planning effort. You all know there's a very small gas station in Crabapple. They may not be there forever, but if they do relocate, we wanted to make sure that we had standards for that. And so we incorporated, again, architectural detail, provisions for the placement of pumps, and then very importantly, standards that would minimize light pollution on adjacent residential properties. And then finally, on this slide, we also incorporated current design and signage standards based on the recent updates that were done to the City of Milton sign ordinance. And then the final part of Article 4 talks about architectural character. And this was actually one of the most challenging parts of the form-based code to write. The previous Fulton County zoning for crabapple was extremely cumbersome with regards to the design of buildings. What we wanted to do and what we hope we achieved as part of this form-based code, working with Lou Oliver, who some of you may know, he was a consultant on the architectural piece, we determined a way to minimize and refine architectural standards that would apply to all new development in the crabapple area. We developed about 10 criteria that are very general, including materials that are allowed, prohibitions against certain materials, certain foundation standards, certain porch standards, and then we created a series of supplemental architectural standards that would only apply to commercial and mixed-use buildings within this area. These are things like how materials are located in a building, and then very importantly, a series of potential architectural standards that could be applied within the crabapple area. These are extremely general. They are backed up with a series of renderings that, again, are for guidance only. The actual interpretation of whether a building falls under these styles is subject to the DRB and the planning and the community development director. But what we wanted to do was make the Fulton County regulations more simpler, and then very importantly, much easier to understand within the crabapple area. So we provided those as well. These are just more examples. And then one of the other things that was done, not part of this particular ordinance, but I just wanted to let you know of for reference, is that we also created a series of stricter parallel architectural standards that will be applied through the Historic Preservation Design Guidelines for designated historic properties in crabapple. So we've made sure that those regulations within crabapple and within the Historic Preservation Guidelines are considerate of one another as part of this effort. And then finally, the form-based code ends with Articles 5, 6, and 7. Article 5 is basically all of the tables that I've shown you. We wanted it to be in one area just for ease of production and reference. It talks about definitions in Article 6. And then finally, it includes what is essentially an appendix, but a lot more detail on architectural style, which is completely for reference. Nothing in that portion is binding. But again, we wanted to put it in here to provide guidance. And so what we hope that we've done is created a form-based code that is something that the City of Milton can use in crabapple, and then also think about using in other parts of the community. For example, perhaps Deerfield or other areas where a community visioning process has determined the need for a new type of zoning and a new type of zoning that can relate to a publicly supported planning effort. So with that said, I'd love to answer any questions you had about the form-based code before we go to Rick's TDR presentation.
Questions for Caleb?
Yeah, I was noticing under lighting, you have a thing that requires incandescent lights. That's going to be very difficult going forward. Incandescent lights will no longer be produced in this country.
Yes, and I believe it says incandescent or equivalent, does it not?
Nope.
No? Well, I will fix that.
Also, too, Section 1.7.5, I'm not sure I understand that paragraph. Could you kind of walk through it with me? I kind of got confused as I was reading it. 1.7.5, TDR transfers.
I'm going to let Rick cover that. He's
Okay.
going to talk about TDR.
Okay.
If we could hold that until he presents, that
Sure.
would be.
Do you guys want to hear the TDR part and then
Yeah.
do everything together? Or do you want to
No, let's, I mean, I think for
okay.
yeah, for Gabriel's question, I think we could wait, but let's see what other questions we have at this point.
It depends how we're going to administer the evening.
Well, this is really, the purpose of tonight is solely for the purpose of us getting a chance to talk to Caleb and to Rick about this. We're not voting on anything. This is going to be on the agenda for us at the next meeting.
Okay.
So this is really to try and get enough of an understanding about how this thing's put together so that between now and the next meeting, we will be able to figure out what concerns we have.
And questions we've got on the document, are we gonna go through the document eventually?
Well,
Like we have in the past on some of the others?
That was one question I was going to ask. I mean, I don't know that we want to go through, well, Robin will ask you and Caleb and ultimately Rick how you want to do that. I mean, ordinarily what we would do with these things, Caleb, is do a page turn and go through literally item by item. I don't know whether that's appropriate tonight, because I don't know if everybody's had a chance to read it and is ready to do that, or if we want to have a special meeting to do that between now and the meeting in May. I would prefer to do a special meeting to do that myself.
I agree.
Yeah,
I agree.
George, I mean, I've gone through it, but without the benefit of going through it again,
Right.
hearing your presentation now, some of the things start to make a little more sense, so I think it'd be better for me
Okay.
personally.
So I would say, keep questions maybe at a conceptual level and that kind of thing, and we'll deal with the nitty-gritty at a special meeting between now and our May meeting.
Can I throw in a suggestion? I know Rick won't be back again. I don't know about the availability of Caleb since he's local to, to be able to answer those questions at a special call meeting. But if, as specific as you can be about the TDR, I would encourage that because we only have this one time for his resource.
Okay.
Okay. I guess my question is, how were a lot of the architectural standards developed, Caleb? And particularly in some of the things where we're saying they're prohibitive, and I look at windows, for instance, the grill between the glass and pop-in grills. As far as energy efficient windows, it's becoming basically impossible to get the other type of windows anymore. So that's the type of thing that comes into my mind, is that's a little bit too restrictive. And so how'd you come up with these?
Yeah, Lou Oliver worked with those. And again, for those of you who don't know Lou, he was involved in the visioning study. I'm going to be quite honest with you. The architectural standards are probably the one part of the code where I do think some simplification could be in order. So as the Planning Commission, I would welcome any comments you have in that. What we did want to do, though, was in this draft, make sure that it is as true to the visioning study and the graphics that were in there as possible. I would certainly welcome any comments you have on that.
Robin, would it be possible when we have that special meeting to get Lou to attend?
He is really busy, so I will not even start to promise that, but I think.
We could try, though.
We can try, and
Okay.
then maybe I'll try to take notes, or if you guys can send me your questions about the architectural side, we can definitely get some
Okay.
input from him if he's not here in person.
Okay.
Caleb, was there anyone in these meetings, I only attended one, that represented the disability community?
I don't
Because
believe
several
so.
of these things that I read through, having a daughter who's in a wheelchair, seem to me cause problems. Now, and that's in doors, doorways, two-story retail. Is there going to be elevators in every two-story retail? Those kind of questions. I don't know if anybody's looked at that or not.
If it's a new structure, they're gonna have to go, and if it's
They're gonna have to meet
commercial,
ADR.
public,
Yeah.
they're gonna
Right.
have to be
So-
ADA, so I
okay.
mean, they're gonna have to work around those
Absolutely.
standards. And from what I understand, there were very strict new standards back in March, a few months ago.
Correct.
Enforced, so.
Yeah.
you
When
know,
you
it's-
look at this on the front, you said, well, that never passed. In other words, you couldn't get a wheelchair and so forth. So as long as someone,
Right.
is looking at it from an ADA standpoint.
And that's what our building official does, so, and he's,
Okay.
that's his job, is to make sure.
Because a lot of the questions I had was to that point, so.
It was a
Yeah.
good question.
And you're absolutely correct. I did keep that in mind. We work with a group called Concrete Change out of Atlanta who does
Right.
what are called visitability.
Yes.
And so I may have missed something, quite honestly, but I think that I've removed everything that mandates maximum elevation unless, I know there's a reference that talks about wheelchair ramps in there, so.
1 inch per foot. 1 inch per foot.
And so
In
I
front.
attempted to, but if I've missed something or
Okay.
inadvertently.
I didn't go through it that,
Okay,
to
okay,
that degree, so I don't want to be the judge on that.
yeah.
That's all I had, overall.
Paul?
And I've got a bunch of stuff. I don't know, maybe just a couple things, I guess. Why doesn't senior housing count towards density calculation?
That is a current City of Milton requirement, we were informed, that if the city council improves it up to 15 units per acre, it can occur anywhere.
It's a special use permit.
It's a special use
Just
permit.
over on Bethany Bend, you guys approved that a few years ago. So if it's senior housing, to purchase, that there's still that use permit to go over on a parcel that they could go up to in a residential area, 20 units per acre.
Right, but we still need to have a grasp on what the total density is going to be in the area, don't we?
Well, I mean, they would have to come in through for a use permit. They can't do it through just the regular form-based code. So if they would request it, it would have to come in and be reviewed by you and city council for the use permit.
Okay, all right.
So I mean, it's not something we would automatically give them. They would have to request it.
Right. I endorse senior living, especially in Crabapple. I think it's a great solution to the fact that we've got this aging community here that don't want to move away from Milton. And what better place to consider lifestyle than to plan for it in Crabapple? So I certainly endorse it, but I want to make sure that we're not giving away a regulation that we have had consideration of before.
Right, we're not getting rid of it, and then, I mean, I guess they could do senior housing up to the amount that's density permitted per the transit zone. If they want to go beyond it, then they need the use permit.
Okay. And then, under instructions, it talks about the, just as one example, the mandatory public
Where are you,
frontages.
Paul?
I'm on
101?
page 8, 2.1.1 F. It says mandatory public frontages along existing thoroughfares in terms of instructions. But it never references anything about future thoroughfares. Is that making the assumption that everything is going to be planned and there are no future thoroughfares?
No, what that means is that is referencing the infill regulating plan. When you go to Article 3, there are standards that are required for Crabapple, Birmingham Highway, Mayfield, Lower Broadwell, and Broadwell.
Right.
So those have to be met. Anything else is also within Article 3, but it's much more flexible. If we wanted to, we could come up with a specific standard for the northwest connector, i.e. the bypass, but we create a greater range of what you can do there,
Okay.
as currently written.
Okay. And that makes sense to me, but just the fact that there wasn't a reference to future planning, it just left me wondering, why.
Yeah, and the thoroughfare network, each thoroughfare type has a specific set of
Right. Yeah.
frontages,
I did see that.
both public and private within it.
Okay. I could not, for the life of me, on page 9, under 2.3.1, find section 64-237. Is that, it says it doesn't apply, but I
Well,
don't.
it's not, that's within, I think, the zoning code, not under.
Yeah, within the city.
Okay.
You couldn't find it in the zoning code?
Well, I didn't look in the zoning.
Okay.
I wasn't thinking about it being from the zoning.
Yeah, we've-
64 references chapter 64 of the
Okay.
zoning code.
And can you remind me what that?
I know what it is. It's the part of the zoning code that talks about within a project, if you have residential and commercial within a project, you have to have a certain buffer distance.
Okay.
It says that within Crabapple, that does not apply.
Because
That
we're
hasn't
applying a
applied
whole
to
new
the
set of
project.
standards based on what we're doing. Okay, that makes sense to me now. Are we not contemplating the equestrian community as we're designing this plan for Crabapple?
The Greenway Trail provision,
Well,
actually,
I'm under Article 3, Public Standards, page 10. Under 3.1.3, it talks about thoroughfares are intended for the use by vehicular, bicycle, and pedestrian traffic, and to provide access to lots and civic spaces, but it does not contemplate the equestrian community in that. Is that by choice or just by oversight?
it's oversight. I will add that, because they are within the definition of greenways.
Right.
And one of the things that came in the visioning study was to have a separate bike trail and a separate greenway trail.
Yep.
So I'll make
Yeah.
sure I fix that.
Yeah, we've all seen Lou's renderings of that. You know, it has some appeal to us.
Equestrian. Good catch.
Do you mind, George, if I'm going to this level of detail?
No.
Okay. Under thoroughfares, under 3.3, bicycle facilities. I didn't see anything that specifically addressed like size and, size, I guess, of bicycle lanes. Does it, I know it's referenced, and I saw in some of the, streetscape, you were showing bicycle lanes. Are you working with a hard bicycle standardized lane size?
We haven't for the bike lane. Again, all of the thoroughfare standards are subject to whatever Carter approves
Okay.
as part of his negotiation.
Okay. I just want to make sure that as we're contemplating this, which is fantastic that we're including it to be so non-vehicular friendly, that we make sure that we really do consider the comfortable riding space, so that we don't just say we're going to be friendly to bicycles and pedestrians, but that we truly are with giving them the space that they need. I know that, didn't we as a city just recently adopt did we take the state code for the 3-foot rule, that kind of stuff on?
Yes.
Okay, so that kind of, I want to make sure we're contemplating that kind of stuff. Under 3.2.2, same page, it talks about under the greenway requirements may be satisfied by warrant by providing a minimum 30-foot wide open space corridor in the approximate location shown in the Crab Apple regulating plan and granting the city of Milton access easements for future multi-use trails. But it does, it just references the fact that we're doing it. It doesn't necessarily address the standards for the greenway application. Is that a correct statement?
I think those
that would
are-
come later. I think about some of the things that Lou presented to us where, in his greenway applications, there was a consideration for, to the point we just talked about a minute ago, horse trails, biking, pedestrian, the potential for the separation of the two. Are we going to actually impose, which I think is a good idea, standards for what those should look like within that 30-foot wide open space?
The only current standard we have is written, when you go to the definition of greenway, it references then the definition of multi-use trail, which is a shared bicycle, pedestrian, or golf cart way running independent of a vehicular thoroughfare and with a minimum width of 12 feet. We
Right.
don't talk about the width of the equestrian component, so
Right.
I can certainly do that if you'd like.
Okay, that'd be great.
Okay.
Thank you. Again, I'm on had sort of a bicycle theme going for a while as I was going through this. On page 11, under, I guess it's a carryover of 3.3.1 under C, where it's the retrofit of existing thoroughfares shall be accomplished, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We talk about widening of sidewalks, adding trees, adding public lighting. We don't, again, reference the possibility of bicycle lanes there. Is that an appropriate place to consider adding a reference to contemplating the bicycling community?
Think about that.
It may not be. Obviously, it was top of mind for me when I was reading. If we're contemplating bicycle lanes throughout, obviously I can imagine there would be an integration. It doesn't have to be written everywhere as long as we're contemplating it.
I can, let me think about that, just
Sure.
for your reference. Every version 4 will have all the changes we're talking about marked and underlined, so
Okay.
it'll be very easy for you to track them.
Great. Thank you. Under building form on page 14, there's obviously a pretty not sizable, but a section that was struck under 4.5.1B. The maximum building size shall be as follows. And we are suggesting a couple new sizes that were unfamiliar to me prior to reading the document. Can you help me understand why we've taken some of those standards out and we've taken some of the numbers up?
Yeah. Fulton and then your current adopted code has a differentiation if a lot is under 4 acres or
Right.
bigger than 4 acres.
Right.
Because we're thinking about more the achieved result, the desired result, rather than the lot size, we received feedback that the 25,000 was more appropriate, that we should take out the thing that references if the lot happens to be under 4 acres, so we did that.
Okay, I'm completely okay with the taking out the consideration of the lot size, because to your point, and you can't accomplish some of these things in the visioning process or in the end task if you have to put on some of those parameters. But when you get into the 25,000 square foot range, you're talking about a pretty good sized building again. And have you had examples of this kind of plan coming together with a 25,000 square foot business of, let me ask the question differently. Let me start with this. Is the 25,000 square foot consideration a single entity, where it's a
Yes.
grocery store or an anchor store or a?
No, it is a single building.
So it's,
But
it's
it could have
more
multiple-
likely
it could have multiple-
subdivided.
it could have multiple
Absolutely.
businesses, yeah.
But can it be a single entity?
Yes, as written, it could be.
From form-based standpoint, what difference does it make?
Well, because a 25,000 square foot size business is going to provide a whole different kind of traffic and parking demands.
But the aesthetics
parking
would be,
demands.
the aesthetic would be the same.
Yeah, I get that. But,
So
It's like-
you're talking about use as opposed to form.
yeah, I am.
And I think too, we're forgetting that we're getting rid of the height limitation of 30 feet, that
Right.
you could have a 25,000 square foot building.
Right,
where
with
you
a small
easily have
footprint.
A small footprint. You know, if you had the 3 to 4 story.
Right.
The actual mass won't.
That
be
part I
that
buy
way.
into. The part that I was worried about was when you start putting, there are two parts to it, or 3 parts to it, I guess. One part was traffic, of a single entity drawing that
Sure.
much traffic. It's one thing to have, 25,000 square feet divided up into 4 smaller businesses, and you can anticipate in any given day, I don't know what take the example, bear with me, it's 15 people potentially occupying that space at any one time. Or in a restaurant, you can anticipate 60. But if, whatever the numbers are. But if it were a Best Buy, is it suddenly 120 or 230? And suddenly you've thrown off all the balance that you get with what I would think you would have in a balanced community setting because of the draw of a single entity that's not by design sort of taken down a notch or two by what the likely foot traffic will be or vehicular traffic will be. So if it's contemplating those things, great. If it's not, I want to at least toss that caution in there for us to think about it some more and figure out what that means to what our end result looks like. Does that make sense?
It does. I'll need to talk to the city and think about it. For reference, just so you know, CVSs are usually 14 to 15.
Right.
Publix will do a tiny, I think the one up at
Birmingham's
Birmingham is about
28.
30.
28.3.
28?
28.3, 28,
Yeah.
yeah.
So if we
And they have done
want,
smaller. They've done 17. I think it's the smallest they've done in Charleston or Savannah or somewhere like that.
if we wanted to go that way and limit the size of individual business establishments, I've done that in other codes. I would still like to have a bigger building size in there because, again, if say you had a one-story, let's say we have a 15,000 square foot Trader Joe's, which is that size, you could still have 2 floors of offices or condos above it under that 50,000 square foot size limit because it allows you to do a bigger building up to 50,000 if there's a ground floor, if there's a grocer in it.
Yeah. I mean, two things struck me with the 50,000 square feet. Was one is, are we getting into a danger zone by referencing grocery stores specifically and not, by being that narrow with it? Do we open ourselves up to an attack of one other business type or another?
You should not. Several cities in the state actually have different use sizes for different types of retailers.
Okay,
And
if
the
we can get
courts
away
have
with
ruled
it, great. And the other thing, getting back to my point a minute ago, is I'm concerned about it being a 50,000 square foot footprint for a single entity. It'd be great if that could go up rather than across. If
Oh,
it's-
okay, I see what you're saying. Okay.
Go vertically.
It's vertical rather than horizontal.
Not a numerical
Yeah.
standard.
Right.
Yeah.
So perhaps rather than the maximum building size, you could think about in terms of building footprint.
Yeah, I think
As a way to
footprint is a
achieve it.
better,
So
is
yes.
probably,
Yeah, I mean, that's what Manchester actually does. They have
Yeah.
a building footprint
I
size.
think that's a solution to any concern I would have about that, is the ability to go vertical. You can still have a significant size entity, but it's not, it doesn't become overpowering in the balance of what I think the storefronts, what I personally would like to
Yeah.
see the storefronts look like.
Yeah. Do you have a sense of what that would be? I mean, I'm thinking,
I mean, what do I think the storefronts should look like?
no, what the maximum footprint would be?
I don't at the moment, without thinking about it.
Okay, let me,
It's probably in the
I think
15 to
you
18,000
That's what I'm
square
thinking.
foot
Say-
range.
18 or something like that.
Yeah,
Max would be 20, so you'd be 40,000 on a
Yeah.
two-story.
yeah. Probably, I'm not going to
okay.
commit to that without maybe getting some examples to look at before I would say that, but I would, for general, for something to contemplate between now and the next time we talk about it, I would say 15 to 18 would be maybe the benchmark.
Okay, then I will take that into consideration and look at some other projects that we've done and just see what they come out at
Okay.
for reference.
Again, keeping with the sort of the thought being about size, on page 15, under the same section, 4.5.1K, where the maximum number of attached row house units in a building shall be 4. Is that based on experience in other
No,
locations that 4 happen?
I believe that is a carryover from the Fulton County
Okay.
for the area.
Because I can argue both sides of that. If you're looking for a row house effect, you screwed yourself by capping it at 4.
I honestly, I think could be about 6. When I do one of these and I don't have a pre-existing regulation or visioning plan, I usually use 6 as a number.
Okay.
It's something builders.
I don't know what the magic number is. I just 4 struck me as a little bit limiting when you're talking about some of the row.
You got that from the Crab Apple overlay?
I believe that's where it came
Okay,
from.
yeah. No, we haven't permitted any townhouses since we've been here, but
I didn't
One's
even,
over
I didn't
here.
even know, I didn't
they're
even
much
know,
higher in Highway 9. I think you can go up to like 10 or 11. I mean, it's much higher.
I didn't even know row house was defined in the current ordinance.
Well, townhouses attached, I mean, we're talking about, yeah, we more refer them to as townhouses. But I think you can't go more than 11 or 12 in Highway 9, which is huge, so.
Is it okay if I keep going?
Sure.
Keep
Go
going.
ahead.
All right.
It's helpful for me.
4.5.5 on page 16. Galleries and arcades. Is gallery being used with a negative connotation, like a shooting gallery?
No,
or
no, no,
versus an
it
art
is-
gallery?
It is a type of building where the sidewalk is covered by a building.
It doesn't define the use.
Right. Oh, wait. I'm not sure I understand that.
A gallery
A gallery
is
is a particular design of building.
Oh.
A gallery is,
Yeah.
if you've been to Dahlonega, you know how some of those buildings literally cover the sidewalk?
Yes.
We couldn't allow it on those streets for a couple reasons. One, they're DOT routes, and you can't do anything like that in the DOT right-of-way.
Right.
The second reason is that on those particular streets, we have defined what that public frontage is. So you've got to do trees, you've got to do an
Right.
uncovered sidewalk. So you can't have trees in an uncovered sidewalk
Okay.
if you're building cantilevers over
Makes
it.
all sense to me now that it's not use, that it's
Yeah.
style.
That doesn't mean it couldn't be a shooting gallery.
Or an art gallery.
What's an
But it
arcade?
just-
Same thing, or?
The main difference is an arcade has piers at the back of the curb, a gallery cantilevers over.
Yeah.
Those are defined in, I think, table 6. There's a
Yeah.
picture of them.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
I didn't get that far.
4.6.4, manufacturing functions.
Yes.
Can you help me understand that?
We have a couple properties that are actually zoned M1 today, one of which is where Milton's is. And,
Because of its historical use, not because of its current use.
well,
But
Right.
underlying is an M1, so it's unconditional M1 at this point in time. So if you take away that, their use of that property, is that?
well, here's the bigger concern.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
I'm not sure if this will be an issue, but we have seen in certain communities, and if this isn't an issue in Milton, we don't have to have that, but where a bakery comes in. And they have a little retail shop, but they sell to, Trader Joe's or
Right.
so-and-so. We wanted to make sure that those did not constitute manufacturing, and they would continue to be allowed where they're allowed today in the M1 properties.
Okay. But actually, in the example that you just gave, it may even be applicable to, or maybe even appropriate to consider it to take it up, take zoning up in some instances, to allow for something like that to be, to have a corner bakery.
So let me ask if, not to jump in on you, Paul, but if I wanted to put in one of those M1 districts, doesn't matter what the facade looks like, but my use is going to be assembling computers. Does that constitute manufacturing? The way I read it, it does not.
Yeah, I'm going to read the definition. It was what I can.
Well, the word that bothers me in the definition is artifacts.
Yeah. Manufacturing, premises available for the creation, assemblage, and/or repair of artifacts using table-mounted electrical machinery or artisanal equipment, and including their retail sale on site. So computer manufacturing would probably not be.
Right, and I'm not sure that's our intent, because artifacts to me is extremely narrow, and I'm not sure whether that's the intent or not. But this kind of is to Paul's point. If we defined the aesthetic, a use within that was somebody assembling computers, I could care less about, right? Mm-hmm. Limiting it to artifacts to me sounds like we're trying to limit it to something that's done in the spirit of the historic, which I think
Carving,
is overreaching.
Wood carvings and then.
Yeah, I think that's overreaching for
I
what
agree.
goes on inside that
Okay.
space.
Agree. But still.
I don't think we should just toss it. But I think we need to make sure we take careful measure of what it's supposed to be. I mean, if you think about, it wouldn't fall here because it's talking about manufacturing. But what if we were to consider, what if something was eventually worked out with the gas station to move to another location, but within Crabapple? You'd still want to, again, this is not regard to manufacturing, but you'd still want the ability to seek placement of that and have it work. But obviously, the zoning, there's no zoning in Crabapple except for where it is that would allow for that. But it
Allow
may
for
make
what?
for the gas station to relocate.
No, gas stations are allowed in C1.
I thought it was only
No.
okay. Well, my point's moved then. So, all right. Just a really nitpicky thing on 4.7.1C. We referenced what's become a standard in Milton, the 3 or 4 board wooden fencing. We don't address color, which we've standardized as well.
Color?
Color.
Okay.
Let me stop you there, because some of these, as opposed to going back through with everybody, because I've got some stuff all over the place here.
Yeah,
Let's deal with that one specifically. Maybe this is helpful or not, I don't know. When we say that the wood fencing is going to have wooden posts in the first layer, and I look at the drawing, I can't remember which one it is, that defines what the first layer is. I can't remember which drawing it is, sorry.
I think it's 12.
It's 12, yeah. When I look at the first layer, if it's a corner property, and help me if I'm not reading this right, Caleb, when I look at the picture, the layers are defined on what I would call a corner property. So the first layer looks like it's some amount of space from the lot line to the house or to the structure, and then the lot line to the structure on the side, front and side, right? It doesn't dimension it at all.
No, it doesn't, because it varies.
But it doesn't say anything about, the implication, the way it's drawn, is it doesn't say anything about the property next to it. Is it intended that the first layer, for the frontage, I can understand that. Does the secondary, does the first layer on the side apply equally to a property that doesn't have a sidewalk next to it? It's still the distance between the property line and the side of the house,
If,
the side of the structure?
in this drawing, if there was another home here, and and Robin, you might want to look at this since I know you deal with the enforcement.
Page you and George?
This becomes the
It's page
front.
26.
Yeah, page 20.
I'm sorry, one of my overall
It's table
comments is that
12.
none of these things are numbered.
Yeah.
So it's table 12 anyway. No, it's not numbered. Table 12.
It's table 12.
No, 23 is way back. They skipped from 23 to 26. All the pictures are
Yep.
non-numbered.
Yeah.
Oh,
It's right before you get to page 24.
Right before definitions.
That's the page before 24.
Okay.
Page before definitions.
So if, I guess, George, your question is if there is another lot here, the frontage is going to be here, this is going to be a side. Depending on how the lot here is platted, if it faces that way, your first layer would revert back to whatever your front lot line is, so it may be greater.
Okay, that was my point. So it's not going to be, it's not going to be symmetrical necessarily going along the street, depending on how the streets are configured.
Depending on how the lotting is, correct?
Right, okay. That just isn't clear when you, I mean, it's clear when you look at this drawing, except that as soon as you go outside of the two properties, it's hard to tell what's going to happen. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. On page 19, 4.13.2, under the gas stations, a minimum floor area of 1,600 square feet.
Very good reason.
Okay.
There
That's
have
probably a
been
two-part question. How
examples.
come minimum and how come no maximum? That's my other part.
There is no maximum.
Right.
The maximum would be held to whatever the density was on the site, but the reason we put in the minimum is because gas stations are crafty. And we've had form-based codes where they've come in, they've said, okay, you require us to have a building on the corner. They've literally put in a 10 by 10
That's what I thought.
ATM kiosk.
That's what I thought.
So the point of this is that if you're going to have that building, 1,600 square feet tends to be what BP and Amoco and QT's bigger, but what they use as their retail component.
Okay.
And so we wanted to make sure that there was a way in here so that they couldn't come in, they couldn't say, we've got a building in the corner and we're going to do our
Right.
big QT in the back.
And how about, as you're contemplating other retail structures in the area, are there examples of other 1,600 square foot?
How big's the one in Bethany, Robin?
It's 1,200, it's pretty small.
Oh, the new one in Bethany?
Yeah, it's 1,200
The
square.
reason I was asking that is, if we're asking it to meet these very strict design standards, is it going to look out of scale compared to everything else at 1,600 square feet?
If
But,
you put it on a lot that size, it will.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think 1,200, since you have a precedent, is a better number?
No,
That is
No.
awful.
no, bigger's better to avoid another
No,
one
yeah,
like
bigger's
that.
better.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As long as it doesn't come with all the bright lights and everything else that comes along with it. Yeah.
Well, I mean, there are other things in here that would not have been, the 50 feet, the canopy's being 50 feet from any property line, that one would never have been able to be built.
Yeah. I've just got one more, and it's really another one of those picky ones. On page 22, under 4.16.9B, under materials, why is mahogany excluded on doors? Or just as a material?
That's a Lou Oliver thing. I'm going to say it's probably because it's not sustainable. But at the end, he has the thing about tropical hardware is prohibited unless FSC certified.
Right.
So that would seem inconsistent with me.
Yeah, I mean, if we want to do that, just say only FSC certified is allowed or something.
Yeah, I agree.
If mahogany can be certified, I mean, mahogany can be a beautiful doorway.
So strike it and just,
Yeah.
Well, I just asked the question, I guess.
I really don't
If he's
know.
got a really profound reason, or maybe he just hates mahogany, but, and that's possible with Lou, but,
yeah.
Yes, anything's possible with Lou.
Like I said, those architectural ones, he gave me about 4 pages,
Yeah, I bet.
and this is the reduced version. I said, some of this,
I don't understand why leaded beveled glass would be excluded. I would think that would be something
Yeah, I
You
just,
had historic
unless
and
it's,
old antique lead
Yeah.
glass.
well, there's
I
the,
don't
there's the
think-
manufactured ones today that are pretty bad.
Okay,
And then
I'm
if you
thinking
wanna,
more of antique stuff.
you wanna pay a lot of money, you can have a pretty cool one. I happen to have a mahogany leaded glass front door at my house,
Not be allowed.
and
Sorry.
it's pretty darn cool, but I also, you know, had to
But
pay
you
a
don't
pretty
live
penny
in
for it.
Well,
Oregon,
I'd like to ask what Lou means by an overly decorative store-bought variety.
Yeah.
That's exactly what Paul's talking
That's
about on
probably,
those cheap
or it's,
ones.
you know, it's got the gold, you know, it's shiny, and it's just, you know,
So if it's overly decorative and I didn't buy it in a store, it's okay,
there you
right?
go.
I
Your
think that
wife
the
made it.
key,
Could have a flamingo in it or something.
the key word at the
That blazes with
beginning
neon.
of these additional standards, because I recognize that, compliance with the following styles shall be determined by the community development director following comment from the city design review board. Because,
And let me throw out another bit of information.
Where is that comment,
um,
or that statement?
416.4.
On 21.
4.6.4?
Yep.
And let me just say that, obviously, this is a lot to digest as far as even with our design review board, and to be honest, we're a little on the, we're not really beefed up with professionals on the DRB at this point in time, so we have a ongoing contract with a professional architect to help out the DRB, to help work through these things, so try to give you some more confidence about this, so.
Okay.
Yeah. Just as a, I just happened to catch it because you just brought us to there, but 4.16.4 is repeated.
Oh, yes, good catch.
Because
Thank
they
you.
really wanted to know that wasn't the same process.
Well, we're good at that kind of stuff too. You'll find
Yeah, I know.
that, we do that, I've got a couple of those.
They have a competition.
I didn't go.
Well, keep
Courtesy.
in mind that Robin is going to eventually tell me what part of the zoning code this is going
Yeah,
to be
this
in,
is
so
gonna
all
be
these
turned
may
into Muni
change.
code, so it's all gonna change.
Yeah,
Oh,
okay.
then all my work will be.
That's all I had.
Forget it.
So don't get into numbering too much.
Yeah.
I just had a quick question, but going back to the fencing, just more from, I guess,
464, 465,
my
something.
clarification, where it said,
Where are you?
47, page
about the,
16.
Oh, 4.7 point something?
with wood posts in the first layer, I mean, so suppose the fence was put up in the second layer. Would it would not have to have wood posts then?
Let me go to the exact language. I can, what part?
You can't- you can't-
Page 16.
Page where?
Page 16, 4.7.1C.
You can't put up fence in the second layer.
Oh, you can't?
Well, I mean, again, that's the way I interpreted the drawing. The second and third layer would be behind the house,
Okay.
right, or between the houses. It wouldn't be on frontage.
You can put, under Article B, you can do them up to 5 feet if they are not within the first layer.
But they don't have to be wood posts.
No, they don't have the material
But,
restrictions.
I mean, another way of saying it, the way I read it, is that wood posts are required on any street frontage.
Yeah, basically.
You can use stuff elsewhere, but the street frontage has got to be wood posts.
Okay.
And again, that came
Well,
from Lou.
as an example, there
Yeah.
are properties that have brick posts, right, with wood
Oh,
fencing
okay.
in between. You
Okay,
can't do that.
got
It's
it.
got to be wood posts.
Got it, got it.
That was it. That was something that came from Lou, again, as part of that series of architectural provisions that he provided. If you want to allow brick fences and metal fences like you have in front of the buildings behind the old blind dog, according to his interpretation, those were not appropriate. But
But he's okay with black vinyl clad chain link fence.
no, that came from the city of Milton.
Yeah.
Remember how particular Lou is about that stuff? He's had very strong
Yeah.
comments about
Yeah.
current crabapple architecture. So,
Or
Yes.
lack thereof.
yeah.
That's all.
That's it? Joe, anything for tonight?
Just two things. 1.5, which is the section of warrants and variances, and particularly the 1.5.1 and 1.5.2. It seems a little bit
a little bit squishy and a little bit vague. And I don't know where the input came from, but it seems like the community development director at this point has an awful lot to say about what's going to require a variance or not. And I realize it's probably true today, but it just seems it's really squishy. I mean, if I come in and community development director says, "Oh, that's a warrant, I'll prove it," nobody ever sees anything. And just it's a question of what the thinking was behind that.
Well, what that references back to the intent, you're absolutely correct. There's a judgment call. Is what you're trying to do, the variance, the warrant you're trying to seek, or the variation you're trying to seek, is it consistent with the intent of the code? If it is, then it can be handled by warrant, and then you'll probably notice warrants are also defined throughout the code for certain conditions. If it cannot be, then it goes to the BZA. If you would like, I can be more specific about what exactly you can vary, if there's some concern about that.
What's missing for me, and I don't know whether it's what Joe is referring to, and maybe it doesn't belong here, but to me what's missing is a public record of those decisions.
Absolutely, that's true.
There's no requirement in here that get documented, and that's what I would expect to see, so that after the fact, if that decision was made, there's some basis for saying you made a bad decision and here's why.
What do you do today, Robin? Because I did reference 64-1885.
We do track our administrative variances. I mean, we do give them a number, and we actually do, there's only one variance, like a 1 foot variance that you can just do unilaterally without really having any.
But there's no provision right now for warrants, is what I'm saying.
Correct, yes, but I'm just trying to explain to him what we do for administrative variances, is
Right.
that we do actually have, we bring it in, we charge a fee, and we notify the adjacent property owners within 300 feet, and, if we don't hear from anybody, then we're gonna go ahead and give the administrative variance, so, I mean, that's kind of.
And that was my intention. The reference here to 64-1885, that
Okay.
refers to the administrative variance process.
But isn't that only under the BZA when it goes to the BZA?
Yes.
No, 1888 is BZA.
Well, 64-1885 though doesn't reference warrants.
No, it references administrative variances.
Okay.
So my intention here,
Okay, so that would mirror what our administrative is. Communities shall have the authority to approve or in accordance with section 64.
Then if that's the intent, I would say that it approve or disapprove of warrants and treat it as an administrative variance consistent with, right? 'Cause this implies that warrants are going to be covered in that section of the ordinance.
So it's about rewording it a little bit.
Yeah, yeah. Sorry, Joe, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, that's kind of where I was getting at, and I guess I'm still a little bit uneasy about it, in that for administrative procedure, there's some rules as to how far you can go.
Well, and I think that addresses that, but I mean, as far as, I think it's hard to let control. I mean, to be honest, there aren't a lot of things that we do administratively. I mean, it is different than what we currently do in a way, so. I think what you have a problem with is like when we get administrative variance, there's a standard and you're deviating from that standard, but we're not really, and there's a reason for it versus with a warrant, you don't really know exactly why are you giving this.
Right.
Well, not only that, but there's no limit. I mean, you could have something under this, you could have something that's clearly a variance, and the development director says it's a warrant, and I'll just sign off on it, and
Right.
that's the end of it.
And you really have to hope that there's continuity from the vision of
Yeah.
what the deciding bodies had been prior to that, and the vision of the director of community development, or community development director. If he or she doesn't share that same vision, the authority they've got is pretty darn significant.
It seems to be.
Or, other than, of course, the HPC, which
Right.
We haven't gotten there
By
yet.
the way,
I haven't gotten there yet.
But, and I don't know what the fix is to that. I mean, the fix is to define it very specifically. The warrant can be used for these types of things. But I'm sure that would require a major rework of this section.
The definition of warrant is a ruling that would permit a practice that is not consistent with a specific provision of the code, but is justified by the intent, and it then references section 1.1. So hopefully, and the staff person making that call, they will reference with some degree of professional comprehension of what this means, whether or not it's consistent with the intent.
And cite which section of 1.1 it actually is they're using to justify it. Yeah. Before Joe moves on, while we're in that same section, 153 says variances shall only be granted by the Board of Zoning Appeals. What about concurrent variances?
This doesn't go through a zoning process, so there won't be any concurrent variances.
Sorry?
There won't be, for a development, there wouldn't be a rezoning. It would just all be done administratively. So there would never be a case where you would come concurrently.
There could be, if you do it an infill regulating plan.
Okay.
So do you want me to add that? I wasn't.
Yeah, I guess
okay.
with infill regulation.
Do you know what? We'll coordinate them.
We'll coordinate between, yeah.
Well, the other thing is, what, maybe I misunderstood. If somebody has a property that's in, I don't care, let's say it's in T2, does that mean that they can't come in and ask for variance to be considered as T3?
They cannot ask for a variance to change use, no.
To change use? I didn't say use.
The change of a transect zone is essentially a rezoning. And
I know, that's what I'm saying. Can they not come in and ask for a rezoning?
they can ask for a rezoning, absolutely.
So if they're asking for a rezoning and there are concurrent variances with it, that's all.
I'm just thinking if something is consistent, you wouldn't get it.
Right, right, but I mean, this doesn't preclude people from asking for,
Right,
for
some-
rezonings
No,
of properties. Okay. Sorry, Joe.
No, that's okay. The other thing had a question about was on page 21, the 4.16.2, the different styles. And did that come out of the visioning?
That's little.
.1 point, which, George?
4.16.2.
That's Lou all the way.
Oh, yeah.
The examples that are shown in the back appear to be all residential type.
That's correct.
Was there any thought as to how that would be applied to a commercial type?
There is, I've got to find where I put it.
Well,
That's the ca-
can I ask a question? If you look at the one right before that, Joe, it says the following standards shall apply to all buildings except detached single-family residential.
Right.
So those styles that are in the back are not intended to apply to single-family residential. Is that the intent?
The additional standards.
Which includes the building styles?
Yeah.
I mean, you're correct in that the images are all single-family, and I thought that I had put in,
It says except.
oh, here we go. 4163. I knew I had it in the beginning. Okay, this is a de facto way of saying, or a roundabout way of saying that if you are doing a building that is more of a traditional mercantile or mixed-use building type, because it has a shop front, which means continuous ground floor glass, a gallery, or an arcade, you may utilize simplified interpretations of one of the styles identified above, wherein conformance with the style is achieved through the use of stylistic architectural detail. Essentially, that would mean if you wanted to do something that looked like a Main Street building, think of Main Street Alpharetta, because what we have in Crabapple aren't really traditional Main Street buildings. You could take elements of those, a window detail, a material use on a railing, apply that to what is essentially an otherwise commercial or brick building, and it would not look like a single-family home. Historically, the single-family homes can be built, they can have whatever they want in them, so they can have commercial in them. They can look like a single-family home but have commercial in them, or they can be this more mixed-use typology. Now, if they are only, and in fact, a single-family building type that has a single-family dwelling unit in it, they are not beholden to those. So any of the infill lots in Crabapple Crossroads or Crabapple Crossing wouldn't have to follow these. But if you were building a building that you knew you were going to put a commercial tenant in and you were meeting all the building code requirements for a commercial tenant, you would be able to use either a single-family housing type as defined here or the simplification thereof.
Okay. Well, and I guess where that question is coming from is the building that Old Blind Dog is in is none of these.
No.
And for continuity purposes, if somebody wanted to build similar-looking buildings the rest of that way, they couldn't do it.
No, you could. I would argue you could. I mean, it's.
I mean, it's called federal style, which
Yeah.
none of these.
In that point, you're correct.
Huh?
We'll just add it onto the list.
Okay.
In that point, you're correct. Yes, but I thought you were referring to the flat roof, pull to the street type thing. But yeah,
Okay.
Well,
I think you need to get him up here.
yes, we do. Can you go back, we need to talk about this section in a little more detail. 4.16.1 says the following standards shall apply to all buildings except detached single-family residential.
Yes,
All the pictures are detached single-family residential.
Right.
as a building type, but not as a building
Okay.
use.
How far down the list does that 4.16.1 apply?
Everything in 4.16.
So shutters, roofs, none of these things apply to single-family residential in this area?
That's correct. The
None
only
of
thing
the-
that applies to single-family residential is the previous section 415.
So should this types of buildings be included in 4.15?
No. And here's the reason. All of those infill lots, again, in the Wheeling projects, they do not meet these standards.
Really?
No, they don't.
I mean, they're pretty generic.
Yeah.
They're just generic suburban houses.
So what I had to do,
Oh, wait, oh, I'm sorry.
Brayburn,
Rayburn.
Yeah.
what I had to do is I took and I created, again, Lou gave me a list of what he would love. And I said, okay.
That was your
Some of those-
mistake. That was your mistake.
I said, some of these make sense in the commercial, the buildings that are going to be on the roads, the higher intensity, more expensive building types. Some of them do not. So what I did is I took everything that I thought could, from a builder point of view and from what had been built to date in Crabapple, that could apply to both the single-family lots and the commercial, and I put that in 415. So 415 applies everywhere. Currently, Wheeland and Jolly can build whatever they want. They don't have to go to the DRB. They are going to have a minimum set of standards in section 415 today that do not reference style because their buildings are all over the place, quite honestly.
Okay.
But it does reference materials. It does reference a little bit windows, shutters, chimneys, those things that are really stylistically neutral. When you get into style, meaning how those parts fit together, those only apply to buildings that will house commercial uses. So again, we talk about this being form-based code, but this
it's not.
particular component is sort of blurry because it isn't. It's more of a Main Street type building. If you wanted to, if you found that confusing, I could simplify it and say that that section applied to all buildings in T5 and T4 open. It's going to have the same de facto result.
I guess my response to that would be, and we're novices to this, but we're figuring it out. It is still confusing, but it wouldn't be after too much more time spending, investing a little more time on it.
Yeah.
And with the benefit of experts like yourselves, or as you hope, someone in staff's rank and file will take it upon them as an obligation to learn this really well. So we've got a resident expert.
The community development director sure is heck better.
Yeah, well, there you go.
She's
The
giving
only,
me plenty
the
of
only
confidence.
concern I would have to that is with that being said, where you are developing some resident experts, what you don't want to have is a builder or a developer who's coming to the area and saying, oh my goodness, this is so complex, I think I'll just go to Forsyth instead and pass over Milton that may have been a valuable developer here. As long as our code is explainable.
Yeah, part of the task here was supposed to be to simplify this.
Right, well, I mean, as far
But it's
as.
also to set a standard. I
Hey,
have no problem with
yeah.
setting a
Yeah,
really
yeah,
high
yeah.
standard. 'Cause
Yeah,
we want it to
but
be
I mean, to
different.
your point, it was, part of the intent was to make it simpler for somebody to understand what applies to them in a given situation than what we have
But we
now.
are raising the bar on the expectation, which
Yeah.
is fantastic.
Yeah,
Well,
We've-
I mean, obviously, as you become more familiar with the code or the rules, you're gonna know it. I mean, just like I typically know things off the top of my head because I've been around it for so long. There is gonna be time for, a learning curve, but that's why, Kathy has also asked for this availability of an architect who's very familiar with form-based code and has used it and practiced with it. So, we're not just out there flailing by
is that
ourselves.
architect gonna review this before it's adopted, or is he on consulting after it's
He's
adopted?
consulting afterwards, yeah. I mean,
It seemed to me
But I
we'd want him
still-
to review it
oh,
before
and
it's
he has a
adopted.
copy too, I'm sorry, yeah.
Yeah, we would certainly want his input before it gets adopted, I would think.
So, I mean, and to be honest, it's probably gonna be me more than Kathy administering it. So, I mean, obviously she'll make the warrants and all that, but, I mean, the
Yeah.
everyday review of it is gonna be me and Angela and the assistance of the architect.
Joe,
Done.
anything else? Okay, my turn. Let me go back to the beginning. Sorry, I want to try and keep it at a high level. I just have some general questions. Robin, one of the things that would help, at least for me, when we look at these maps is, because I've kind of lost sight of it, can we either do an overlay or something that shows the boundaries of the Crabapple character area versus what's included in this form-based code
It's exactly
area?
the same.
It's exactly what we did.
We did that on purpose.
Okay, good. Secondly, the area of the original visioning study
Right.
and Lou's study as compared to what's here?
Well, I think the visioning study is Lou's study.
No, I'm talking about the Fulton County,
Oh, the full.
the original Crabapple plan.
Okay.
Not in detail, just the boundaries.
Yeah, which is the overlay district. Okay.
Right, just the
Yeah.
boundaries.
So you want to see that on there? Is that
I-
what you're asking?
Well,
Yes,
I don't even know that it needs to be it doesn't need to be part of the standard. I just think it'll help me understand a little bit better how this is being applied to what's already been done before.
Okay.
Within there, and I think we talked about this before, but as I look at some of these areas, I'm not sure how we've defined where one thing starts and another thing begins, where one transect starts and another transect begins. For example, I mean, I'm okay where we're going from distinct AG1 to R2 to T2, but when I look, for example, at the purple areas down in the lower right-hand corner where we've got T4 in one area and T4 restricted in another area, where does that boundary between T4 restricted and T4 start and stop?
I would have to see exactly where you mean. The only T4 restricted should be within the two HOAs that asked for the creation of it. The Crossroads and the station.
Well, T4 open is in, did I say open or
Yeah,
restricted?
you said restricted.
Restrictions.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I meant T4 open.
T4 open, this is actually one of the things we changed based on stakeholder input. there were some properties that were shown in the comp plan as mixed use, and even though they're zoned AG1 today, the property owners pointed out that it was shown as developing in the visioning study. It was land use designated as mixed use, so we changed it to T4 open because that would be consistent.
So by intent, your lines are property lines, the
Yes,
boundaries?
absolutely.
Okay, they're not random, they are property lines in all
Oh,
cases.
never,
They're
never.
not tax lots or something, okay.
Just, can we just take a moment on that?
Yeah, sure.
I just want to make sure we don't overlook what he just said, and that was that there are some people who think that they are maybe entitled to an upgrade of zoning based on a map that they saw that was speculation. There's nothing that's been approved. There's no entitlement to that.
That's correct.
Just to be clear.
Well, I think they're just looking at what what right now they have. And
Well,
what's
yeah, that's
equitable.
different, though. I agree with Paul. I mean, if we're changing it based on their current zoning, that's one thing. If we're changing it based on the comp plan, that's not right.
They got to come. That's
Well, I
that's
think
what.
most of the issues weren't they
I can show that.
equitable with
But-
what they had already. Not, oh, I would really like this. And
Well,
by the way,
that's not what he just said. It's not what Caleb just said.
What was her name, Sally?
Yes.
Oh, naturally.
I-
Now we're really worried.
yeah.
If you look on the website, there are some older versions, and I think between version 1 and 2, there is a sheet that talks about the changes. There were a few properties, this being one, I know you can't see this, but Charlotte Drive.
Right.
We know where
We
to,
know it.
Enfield, both
Yep.
sides of that.
Yeah.
We initially showed that as T2 because it's zoned AG1. She came to us, she said, I have been shown in the comp plan as mixed use. And so that was one of the things we talked to planning staff about, and we changed it in one of the versions.
So that is not zoned. You're right. That was
She's not, zoned, she's
AG1.
AG1. I initially had it as T2.
we got to put her back to AG1.
So
Yeah. Without going through the process. It's
Yeah,
AG1.
we can't just arbitrarily, I mean, that's effectively a rezoning of that property.
Wasn't it the same on T4 down on Arnold Mill?
Yeah.
At the corner of that,
Yeah,
on Green Road?
I mean, we may get there, but right now,
Yeah, we haven't
without the hearing for it.
It's AG1.
Arnold Mill, you mean?
Yes.
this thing,
Yep. No, further
Further,
over.
there you go.
Caleb. That's AG1.
It's, I mean, I completely understand what she's saying, and I completely understand her motives. But the reality is, it's not zoned that way today. And we can't just give it to her because it's colored that way on a map. She has to go through the process.
that's a
It's a major.
that's a big change.
Yeah.
Because what we did, and there are only a few locations, but what we did.
Well, it's not to say we're not going to get there, but we just can't.
we're bypassing the
You
process.
just can't make an assumption that you can't wave the wand and grant it to her.
So it sounds like what you're suggesting is that anything that is zoned AG1 today should be T2. Is that correct?
From a where we are to where we have to get to, there has to be something at some point that reflects.
I mean,
T2.
maybe we need to put in two maps that talks
Right.
about the current zoning,
Current.
but a recommended,
Yeah.
transect would be T4 for those, but.
Right.
I mean,
That would,
overly simplified, it would be no different than if we, as a comp plan committee, had approved the comp plan and then made the zoning ordinance change to match the comp plan. We don't have that authority.
right.
Wasn't T5 going to be the same problem? It's showing that as,
Mhm.
it's going to be the same problem.
Yeah, and that's solvable. It's just one more step to the process, that's all. You probably, I mean, I can't speak for the table, but I certainly, with an enlightened vision
Well, I mean, the
for what it's
reality-
supposed to
the
be,
reality
be
is that none of
sympathetic
the-
to where it's supposed to go.
None of the property owners are going to object to these changes because they're all upzoning,
Of course,
right?
of course, yeah, they're.
But that doesn't mean the rest of the community is going to be okay with it.
Right.
And the community may be okay
Or
with
the
it once
city
they
council.
see the grand vision and understand it with the benefit of all these kinds of things. But
Yeah.
we have to show we have to show a reality check of what it is, and then proposal map, what it can look like if we do X, Y, and Z.
So it would mean that if she wanted that T4, that she'd have to come in for a rezoning, because you're skipping
Sure.
over some transect. But I think that staff's.
Well, unless the city council wants to take on the possibility, I mean, and unilaterally rezone those properties to these new transect zones and accept whatever challenges come from that. But I don't think that it can be done just by us saying this map looks good, or even city council saying the map. I think each one of those specific situations where that's happening has got to be identified and approved.
It may very well be that there's a residential owner over there that says, you know,
Or the person that lives next door that doesn't get it, and when that guy next door gets it, and his property just went up, why don't I
that's
have
an
that?
that's the whole point of our process.
And that's an
why the boards
arbitrary.
exist.
Arbitrary and capricious. Then you get sued.
And it's a layer of, that we didn't,
Yeah, but unless we're missing something, I mean.
You're, this is absolutely this is a critical piece of the code. I mean, that we need to determine if essentially we don't want to change density. We want to codify everything else, but we don't want to codify the transect zone changes. That's a decision for the city to make. And like I said, it's
well, the vision is great. It's just some of the steps are a little bit tricky to get there. But we can't ignore the fact that we do have some policy and procedure in place.
Well, I mean, maybe ultimately it's a Ken question. I mean, I could see, in theory, putting this map in front of the city council and asking for them to approve it, but they'd have to recognize when they're doing that they're approving rezoning of properties that aren't being requested by the property owners, and they're gonna have to be willing to accept whatever challenges come from that.
But isn't this considered like an overlay, and so there's still really the zoning underneath? I thought that's what part of the explanation was for. So does that zoning totally go away?
as currently worded, it's an overlay, but you have a swirly provision in your zoning code that says if it's in an overlay, regardless of what the underlying zoning is, the overlay supersedes.
Well, but it doesn't dictate the density, though. Nothing tells us it, nothing in our overlays talk about density
Yeah, I
and
know.
square footage.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think that, I mean, it's definitely a question that needs to be answered, but I think that it's not like it's a horrible thing. I think
Well,
we just have to deal with it.
Going from AG1 to
I don't think
T4.
I don't think any of the overlays currently contemplate a higher
And I agree
zoning
with
or
that.
higher.
It doesn't deal with density, it doesn't deal with.
Well, not only density, but use. I mean, you're not gonna go in and put a commercial use on an AG1 property just because there's an overlay that says you can do
But I
that.
don't know about this
Well,
not
right,
here.
but I mean, and that's why it needs to be changed. I mean, it has to be, like you said,
Well, one way or the other's gotta be reconciled, yeah.
yes.
It would make, I mean, what would be cleanest for me, quite honestly, just if I were approaching this before y'all had told me at the beginning of the process that it was an overlay, I would have done a freestanding just district. You essentially rezone all crabapple to the crabapple form-based code, and you don't really worry about the underlying, so you avoid inconsistencies. But Kathy said that she was comfortable with the overlay.
Yeah, to me, the overlay doesn't simplify anything either. If anything, it complicates it even more. I mean, I agree with you. If city council is willing to take that on and to rezone the whole study area in accordance with this, that's what they should do. All I'm saying is I think, in fairness to them, the specific properties that are being basically upzoned in that process need to be identified so they know what they're doing. Giving them this map without that explanation, they'll get blindsided.
Well, and
It's not like anybody's going to complain because they're talking about
Well,
potentially
except,
a higher property
except as
value.
Mark said, the adjacent property
Yeah.
owners might have a
Right.
complaint.
Absolutely.
well, and the other thing I want to point out, is talking, that it's just not those that we pointed out. There may be others within this.
Right.
They need to look at all of that,
Right.
because we're not, I mean, I'm not sure up on, some of these areas that it is zoned
Right.
other than AG1.
Right. Well, we're not going to solve that here tonight, but
No,
it's something we need to.
just a point.
So, Caleb, with all due respect, and I don't want to keep Rick waiting much longer, we apologize. High-level stuff, when again, starting in the beginning, 1.2.1 talks about capitalized terms. It basically says capitalized terms are either defined here or are going to be afforded their commonly accepted meanings. There are examples throughout here, I think, where we've got some capitalized terms that are not defined here, and I'm not sure what the commonly accepted
Are there?
mean. Well, let's talk about senior housing as an example.
Okay.
What does senior housing mean?
That is not defined in this, but that is defined in the city's.
That to my point, there isn't any reference in 1.2.1 to capitalized terms that are defined elsewhere in the ordinance. It talks about either in Section 6 or Section 7 or commonly accepted meanings.
So we could reference the city code.
I'll have to check that. That is probably,
I mean, I think that's kind of where I was going. I assumed that the intent was that once this is captured as part of the overall ordinance, that things that are defined elsewhere in the ordinance would apply and not just in Section 6 and 7 here.
that's correct, yeah.
We talked about the page numbering. That would help. The bottom of page 4, and this may be a question that Rick will answer, but the word full TDR was inserted at the very end of 1.7.1. I don't remember any discussion of less or fractional TDRs. Are there fractional TDRs?
That's the suggestion that's in this version of the code, is that when a sending site property owner actually creates TDRs or TDRs are issues, that those can be fractional. And they can assemble them as they wish, but by the time they're used on a receiving site, you can only use one whole TDR. That's the proposal, at least.
Okay. I guess I didn't read that clearly, but maybe it'll be clear.
Just, can you say it one more time? I think I got most of that, but I want to make sure I got it.
The sending site property owner can be issued fractional TDRs.
Right.
And of course, those can be traded and sold and so on and so forth. But when a developer actually approaches the city and wants to use TDRs to get bonus development, those have to be in whole TDRs. In other words, there's only one TDR, and that gets you so much development in the receiving area.
So a sending property owner, I can appreciate how they would maybe consider being fractional. There's something they want to preserve, but not necessarily by giving up the rights to it forever. They've got a portion of it. How does the assembly work for the development on the other end?
A developer, if a developer has 15 and a half TDRs and he or she needs 16, she's got to go buy a half TDR from someone.
Okay. Thank you. That's what I thought you were saying. I like that.
Page 8, 2.1.3, just want to make sure I understand. One of the things you talked about was the community development director having the latitude to adjust transect zones by up to 300 horizontal feet. Is that 300 horizontal feet total or in one direction? In other words, can it go 300 feet west and 300 feet north, or is it only 150 feet west and 150 feet north? What is the 300 feet applicable to?
I would say that's total.
Total, yeah, I would
Yeah.
say, I would interpret it on each side.
All right.
Well, we probably should find a way to write that so it says it.
Yeah, we just would want to clarify that. Page, some of these are nits. Page 16, 4.6.4A refers to a table, but there's no table number there. It's just an omission.
Oh, okay, yep. Fix that.
Okay, I'm saving some of the bigger ones for last here. Okay. Page 21. Part of this ties back to your presentation, Caleb. One of the things that you showed us that we haven't talked at all about is that at least you showed us a cover sheet on something that's called the Historic District Architectural Guidelines. You said it's not part of this.
No.
What is it part of?
The city has a separate process where they've got a series of historic standards. I think, Robin, they're going through DCA now, is that correct?
Right, but it's a part of the HPC.
Historic Preservation Code.
It's their process to be able, it's a document that the Historic Preservation Commission will use when they evaluate a historic structure / district.
What is it, a reference guide, or
Yes,
is
I
it?
mean, it's like a pictorial reference, I mean, you're the
Yeah.
one who created
So,
it.
so it's not going to be something that's codified?
No, it's like a guidelines. In fact, that's what they're called,
A
guidelines.
lot of shoulds, no shalls.
Yeah.
Okay. Everybody's going to hate me. I sound like a broken record. 4.16.4, it says, except within a historic district, compliance with the following style shall be as determined by the community development director, blah, 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 which implies that within a historic district, the HPC is going to do that.
That's correct. But they will not be applying these standards. If you go to the beginning of the code.
Time out, that's not the question. The question is,
Don't-
if
but
that's,
don't lose
if
that
that
thought.
said, if that said, except for historic properties, I'd be okay with that. To me, this is far too broad. This is giving the Historic Preservation Commission the right to apply those guidelines that you just showed us to things that are not historic properties, which to me is not the intent of all of this. Let's say I throw a net or a blanket around Crabapple, the whole study area, and say that's a historic district, which they theoretically have the right to do. This would say that every property within Crabapple now is subject to review by the Historic Preservation Commission and not by the Community Development Director or the City Design Review Board.
So we need to figure what exactly, Robin, the city calls those. I think
Calls what?
the designated historic properties.
Right,
I
right.
thought it was historic district.
Well, they're working on coming up with a historic district, and we don't have one yet. And so I think that's why George is
Okay.
talking about just using the word structure.
No, I was saying it either ought to say historic property or contributing.
Well, no, I know, that's what I meant.
Okay, okay.
Yeah, but I mean, it's kind of, so let's say if you had 3, 4, or 4 blocks of Crabapple that was a district, and all those buildings within it, would it be non-contributing or contributing that would go to it would just be contributing that would be reviewed by the historic HPC versus,
That's the
what if
question.
they're not contributing, why should they be reviewed by the HPC?
No, they shouldn't, absolutely
Okay.
not.
Is that what you're trying to say?
Yeah.
Right, but they are within the district.
Right, so it
And they
doesn't
should be
apply.
subject-
It's kind of throwing the whole bath out with the.
What if we, a way to get around it, not knowing what the term is going to be?
We know what the term is, we just don't know where,
We
there's
don't
been
know if
nothing
it's listed. It
designated.
hasn't been- the district hasn't
There's
been-
two terms that have been created, historic property and
Yeah.
historic district.
Uh-huh.
And to me, the intent here sounds like it's for historic properties.
I'll,
You may have to talk to Angela, and then we can talk about it more, but I mean, I know what you mean. You
'Cause-
don't want the whole bunch of buildings to be in their
Right.
responsibility if it doesn't apply.
Right.
yeah, because that's also up in the front too. It talks about under the first or second section, how do you deal with it? And I thought, I understand what your point is, George, so we'll make sure.
Kayla, where were you going to go? What was the question you thought George was going to
I
ask?
was going to say, accept properties under the purview of review through the Historic Preservation Commission, and leave it nice and general.
We don't want it to be nice in general.
Yeah.
And very specific.
We're trying, I'll speak for
I mean, you want to
myself.
minimize it. Right?
I'm trying hard to take properties out of the purview of the Historic
Okay.
Preservation Commission unless they have been deemed historic properties.
Well, it says up on page 3, 1.4.3, within historic districts or properties, the Historic Preservation Commission shall review plans for all development in this district with the standards herein prior to the approval of a land use permit, building permit, and demolition permit for both residential and non-residential structures.
Right.
Or partially occupied, the historic district or Historic Preservation Commission's review shall be limited. So, I mean, I guess in the end, you just want structure, you
Yeah, I mean, for me, 1.4.3 should say for historic properties within historic districts.
Mhm.
It may be a definition question then, because I think the reason I added that was because if it's one building on a lot, that whole lot is considered the property. And so you just want it to physically be only the building.
No, as long as the property's been deemed historic, I'm okay with that. The issue for me personally, Caleb, is that if you have an historic home, residence, whatever, but a building, and somebody decides, the Historic Preservation Commission decides that they believe that the area around your home was once had value, so they're going to declare that a historic district. And every property in there except yours is not historic by any yardstick. I don't want to see these things applied to those properties that are not historic. I don't want to see them have to go through a different process than somebody that's just across the line, maybe exactly the same, but because somebody threw a net over it, they now have to be subject to a different set of standards.
So, I know where you're going. So I'm making a note here. I'm going to refer to what exactly the definition is and make sure it only applies to the structure.
Okay.
So there,
Some of these may be Lou questions, but part of them are just curiosity. On page 22, 4.16.8, what is an authentic shutter? I understand fully operable.
I have a couple, if anyone's interested in buying them. They are authentic shutters.
What does that mean?
That they're antique and real.
Well,
Yeah.
what
Well, I
shutters
was
aren't
being
real? I mean, we're not
sarcastic,
talking
but-
about,
Well, I meant like
virtual
really
shutters here.
Right.
Huh?
Antique.
Yeah,
I think-
$30.
I think he's thinking authentic in the sense of
historically accurate. Or,
correct, yes.
Well, but, okay.
I think that's a bit much to ask.
Well, but then
Well, there's a lot
I'll
in
enter
this.
the
It's
word
a bit
vintage.
much to ask.
What would you call a vintage shutter?
yeah.
Anything, everything is vintage.
Thank you. Sure. Thank you, Joe.
Well, continuing on in that same standard, I understand louvers. I don't know that I understand planks. To me, there's two other shutters that are fairly common now. One is kind of vertical, right? That's what I would call planks, and the other is what I would call colonial shutters
I know. I
Okay.
understand
that
what
are
plank is.
divided, right?
It's basically
My house
planks.
has- my house has-
Like it's
That's,
solid.
yeah, right.
No, wait a
My
minute.
house has
Solid, yeah.
Well, my
but-
house has the whatever you call them, colonial, that has the beveled insets, right?
But there is, in the house
George,
next.
that's a louver. What you have. is
No,
a-
no,
No,
louvers
no.
are horizontal slats.
Have it?
George,
Yeah.
you're
No.
okay. You're all right. There is a basic, what they call plank, and it's two boards running this way,
Yep.
okay, with spaces.
Right.
Space in between.
Right.
And then two across this way.
I'm okay with
That's
that.
plain.
What it's leaving out is the kind of shutters I have,
Which
which
is
to me
solid.
is.
Can't
live here.
But they're more historical than any
Then
of
plank,
these.
certainly then plank.
You go to Williamsburg and that's what you're
Yes.
going to see everywhere.
I agree.
Well,
But
no, I think we're going to have a lot.
Anyway, sorry.
Let
We'll talk to Lou. 4.16.11,
Not your-
again, just want to make sure, chimneys shall be tapered.
Yeah, like tapered.
me see.
How many,
Can't
how
have a
many
square-
tapered chimneys have you seen in a historic property?
This,
none, I thought they're all square.
They're all rectangular or square. There's no tapered chimney.
I have seen the taper. I know what he's talking about. And if you look at really, really old buildings from the 1800s, a lot of those old log homes had tapered chimneys
They're
built.
tapered down at the firebox, but when they get up to the,
No, they're tapered up. They go like
Stairs
Well,
this.
you could strike the word tapered and still deliver
Yeah.
what he's after with, and
Yeah.
detailed authentically according to the building style, probably.
Yeah, and I mean, again, we're going to have fun with this part.
Yeah, you'd already said
Please
that when
do.
you-
please do.
I can
Sounds
send you
like
the
Caleb
original
wants
if
to
you
come
want.
and watch.
Probably don't want to see it.
It's a lot of this that I just can't, no.
Okay, I think for tonight, that's all I had. The rest of it, just, yeah, that's it. Oh, one last question at a high level. One of the things we talked about, and you said in your presentation, was this would be something that we might want to think about transferring elsewhere. If we were to consider that, and I know this is a loaded question, but if we were to consider that, how different would that look than what this is?
If you did it over here,
Yeah.
you'd have a new regulating plan, first of all. You would probably also change what your transect zones are, because you've got high rises envisioned. So, your 9 building units an acre would not work. So you'd really need to figure out what those metrics are. You'd take out the size restrictions. You'd really
You'd in essence be starting over. Pretty close.
You'd be changing maybe 30%.
Okay. I just wanted to get a sense of how easy it would be to do that, that's all. Okay. Any other questions for Caleb? Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Rick, sorry to keep you waiting.
No problem.
Yeah.
I do have a 15-minute presentation if you think that would be helpful.
It would be helpful if anybody hasn't seen it, absolutely.
Yeah,
Okay.
I hadn't seen it.
Okay, one of the things to keep in mind, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission, is that
We're not that formal, Rick.
old habits.
George and the guy.
Particularly with no public here.
So, one thing to keep in mind is that what we're proposing here is that the TDR portion of the form-based code actually accomplish a couple of different things, including preserving open space as well as possibly creating parks and greenways and trails. So with that in mind, I'd like to just start out with what is TDR, and then move on to what's actually in the proposed code. So one of the things to keep in mind is that TDR is a market-based tool. It works within the code, and it encourages the voluntary redirection of growth away from places where a community wants less, or in some cases, no development, and into places where the community would like more development. The jargon here is that the sending areas are the term that's given to properties that are appropriate for preservation. That can be environmentally sensitive areas, farmland, can be historic properties. The places that are appropriate for additional growth and where the TDRs are actually being received, logically called the receiving areas. So TDR is voluntary, and one of the ways to picture this is like a dual zoning code. In the sending areas, those are the areas where the property owners decide that they want to consider participation. They have a choice. Those sending area owners can say, I'm not interested in this. I'm just going to use the underlying zoning. However, if they decide that they are interested, the following things happen. The property owner records an easement that meets the qualifications of the code, and in return, the city issues transferable development rights, which are the currency that's used in a TDR program. And the sale of these TDRs is what motivates those property owners to participate in the program. Then in the receiving area, you have property owners who are who have a baseline density that's spelled out right in the code. They can build up to that baseline with no TDR requirement. However, if they want to exceed that baseline and go up to the maximum, those bonus units, if you will, have a TDR requirement attached to them. And of course, it's the...
I'm sorry, but if you go and you record an easement, can you sit on that for years? With transfer title?
Can you retain the
You retain-
TDRs?
Just sit on it
Yes.
and do nothing with it?
That's the way it's written now. You
Okay.
do not have to, you can hold them, sell some of them, sell all of them.
Just sit on it for 10, 20 years?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry.
No problem. So, and it's the additional development potential that the developers get from those TDRs that motivates them to buy the TDRs. Okay, so TDR is used in at least 240 communities that I'm aware of. It has preserved almost 500,000 acres throughout the United States, only used in 2 communities that I know of in Georgia, Atlanta, where it's used for historic preservation, and Chattahoochee Hills.
Can I ask you a question? This is
Yes.
completely off the subject. Go back to your picture, because I'm just curious. The house that's right across from Symphony Hall is the one that's shown on the bottom there. That looks like it's currently got a lot of construction going on. What, is it just being rehabbed? Oh, okay. Sorry.
Yeah, actually, right on our. It's right on my, do you know? Restaurant and B&B type event.
Oh, okay.
The castle, it was,
Yep.
it was recently bought by, I think, like
13th Street.
Cartel or some.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Other.
Thank you.
That looks, that one, that's that one.
Okay, so here's how we're proposing that it be used in Milton, specifically in Crabapple. First of all, the question is, how do you identify the sending areas, the areas that are appropriate for preservation? In Crabapple, it's pretty easy because the regulation map actually maps where those sending areas are going to be, and those are the light green properties, the T2 zone. However, as I said before, we're envisioning that this process be used citywide, and then areas and properties anywhere in the city of Milton that meet criteria, if the property owner is interested, those could be considered as sending areas, and also sending areas for open space, I should say. And furthermore, properties that are identified in an adopted plan, including the Parks Plan, could be considered for parks and greenway type TDR sending sites. So let me explain. I used a couple terms in there.
Rick, can I stop you again?
Yes.
Again, just for clarity. What you said within Crabapple, if this code that we've got in front of us passes, what you said is applicable to Crabapple, but it would not be applicable to anywhere else in the city until they adopted TDRs as part of the ordinance for the remainder of the city, correct?
No, the way it's written now is that the sending areas upon adoption of this ordinance could be created anywhere within the city of Milton. The only place where receiving sites would be, of course, would be in Crabapple until other areas go through a process similar to this.
Okay, thank you.
So I talked about 2 different kinds of sending sites, and what I mean by that is the open space sending sites are those that remain under private ownership, but where the property owner has agreed and has voluntarily recorded an easement that permanently preserves that site for reduced development. Specifically, the site has to be at least 5 acres in size, it has to be zoned Ag 1, and the easement has to permanently impose a density limitation of 1 dwelling unit per property or per 25 acres, whichever density is greater. The difference then is in the park and greenway sending sites. These are actual places that the city has identified as appropriate for parks and greenways and trails and so forth, and typically those are going to be properties that are deeded over to the city or its designated agent. There may be some instances in which some kind of easement arrangement could be made, but in general, that's going to be a change in ownership. So I just want to reiterate that these property owners are free to decline using the TDR option. So in other words, within Crabapple, owners of T2 properties can say, I'm just going to use the underlying T2. That generally allows 1 dwelling unit per, or 1 building unit per acre. Also, outside of Crabapple, throughout the city of Milton, it's the Ag 1 zone that's under consideration as a TDR sending site, and those property owners can use the Ag zone, which in general, on a paved road at least, is one unit per acre. So Let's say that property owners agree and participate willingly in this process, and they record those easements. What do they get in return? How many TDRs, this currency, do they get? Well, the code spells out, as proposed, 1 TDR per unconstrained acre, plus 1 TDR per 4, did I say constrained? I meant unconstrained acre, meaning no water, no wetlands, and so on and so forth, buildable sites, in other words. 1 TDR per 4 constrained acres, those would be sites with water and wetlands, plus 1 TDR for every 5 acres of land in excess of 5 acres. Then, if in fact what the property owner is interested in, and if the city is also finds the site to be qualified for parks and greenways, there's a bonus factor applied for those lands that are being deeded over to the city or its agent. 1.5 times that product from the above formula, if in fact the area is designated in an adopted plan as appropriate as a civic space. 1.25 times that product if it's some other greenway TDR sending site. So, yes.
Can you go back to your previous slide? Mm-hmm. So is the factor of 1.5 or 1.25, that's beneficial to the sender, correct?
Yes. And the, go ahead, sorry.
So is the incentive then to become a sender if you're trying to have your space dedicated to a civic space or other park or greenway? So I want to hurry up and get in line to be a sender, because if my TDR is going to be a single unit, let me see. If I don't get in line fast enough to be considered for a civic space or a park or greenway, I become basically a single unit sender if it's just going to be used for development within the greater Crabapple area. So is that part of why it's written that way?
Well, the point you mentioned is, I think, valid, and that is that there's only going to be so much demand, and people who are really interested in participating might want to participate early. The reason for the bonus factor, though, is that there's a difference in that you're actually deeding over the property when you're offering a property as a park or a greenway. So that's the reason for the 1.25 bonus. The 1.5 bonus is simply because certain properties are considered high priority. And I should have pointed this out on the map of the Crabapple plan. You'll see that there's one area that's designated as a good civic space site, and that's the area around the
Lake
little
on
pond
Mayfield.
on Mayfield
Lake
Road.
on Mayfield.
Basically, the intention there is to give an extra incentive for that property owner to offer that site as a park.
So, okay, so you just brought some clarity for me. Just let me make sure it's correct. And that is, in the incentive areas, like a civic space or other park and greenway, I'm thinking about that. I'm thinking about it literally. No, never mind. I'm thinking about it. If I'm a sender, in those instances of it becoming a civic space or becoming a park or greenway, I'm really not sending my I'm not, there's going to be a use for my property. It's not just going to go, there could be people on it. If I think about, I own 5 acres of land, and I'm going to give up 1 acre in the back. It's near a river. I'm not going to use it anyway. I can get some cash for it. It's cooperating with the city, but there's not going to be anybody on it.
The public acquisition requires that it be open to public access.
Well, that's where I'm going. In the incentive part, where there's a kicker.
Yeah, if you sell that property to get TDRs, you're going to be deeding it over to the city, and part of that is that they would have the right to have anybody use it.
Okay, maybe I misunderstood that.
Yeah,
because if I own 5 acres of land and I want to give up just 1 acre of that, in your scenario, it's available for people to be using. But isn't there an
If
incentive?
you
What if I live
do it
up
through
on,
public acquisition, if you do it through permanent easement, then you can do whatever you want because you retain ownership of it, but you're granting an easement that's permanent
Yes.
that would restrict the development of it.
But if I'm, let's say I'm, the old Chanley property. I've got 1 acre I want to give up for a TDR
Right.
up there. That's not going to be probably accessed by the general public.
It may not be, but
But
part of the
theoretically-
criteria is it has to be available for that.
Yes, okay,
Yeah.
okay, we're saying the same
I
thing.
mean, it may be so remote that, but of course,
Not
if
like-
it's that remote,
But it
who's
might be
going to
in
buy
some,
it?
well, it might be someday that it connects
Sure.
to part of a greenway
Sure.
plan. Okay, I'm on the same page. Thank you.
Now, in the past, there's been some confusion about how these allocation rates work. So I've got some examples here. For example, a 5-acre site, if it's all unconstrained acres, each of those acres would get 1 TDR. This particular site would get no TDRs for constrained acres because there aren't any. Would get no TDRs for acres above 5 acres because there are none. So it's a total of 5 TDRs. Versus this 25-acre site, which would get a total of, under the scenario as I wrote it here, we get 23 acres as follows. Assume you have 17 unconstrained acres times 1 TDR per unconstrained acre. That's 17 TDRs. You have 8 constrained acres at the rate of 1 TDR per 4 constrained acres. So that's 2 TDRs. Plus you have 20 acres in excess of that 5 acre. So you get 4 for that. So you add them all up and you get 23 TDRs. Now, the only difference in the next slide here is that it's the same sites, but this time they're basically deeding it over as park and greenway. So they get, in this case, it's not a civic space, but it's a park and greenway, so you multiply it by 1.25. So what I've talked about mainly so far are the sending areas. Now switching over to the receiving areas. We already touched on this. Initially, the only receiving areas will be within Crabapple, and those will be the T3, T4, and T5 zones. However, as Deerfield, the Deerfield area gets rezoned, and possibly Arnold Mill, if the city likes this idea, they could use it there too, and they could basically increase their demand for TDRs and theoretically increase the amount of preservation that they achieve. The receiving area density limits effectively work like this. As I mentioned before, you build up to baseline with no TDR requirement. When you exceed baseline, you cannot still exceed maximum density. However, you get 2 building units for every TDR that you bring to the table, and that's basically a market consideration. I've been working with Professor Dorfman from the University of Georgia on this project, and coming up with something. The idea is to make a TDR or to sort of hopefully arrive at a TDR that will be attractive to a sending area property owner, yet affordable to a receiving area developer. Because if you don't get that right balance, the program doesn't work. So that 2-to-1 ratio is what we're proposing here. And just to give you an example, in a T4 zone, you've got a 5 building unit per acre baseline. If in fact a developer wanted to maximize the development potential there, that would be 9 building units per acre in the T4. So that property owner, that developer would need 2 TDRs because each TDR yields 2 building units, 2 bonus building units. Another example, in the T3, you've got a baseline of 3 building units per acre, a maximum of 6. If a developer wanted just to get up to 5 building units per acre, they'd only need 1 TDR. So my final slide here has
Stop before you go on.
Sure.
Do we measure density with respect to the transfer development rights portion of this as we currently measure density in the rest of the ordinance?
Yes, it's all in terms of building units.
So we're not backing out undevelopable land, we're not backing out steep slopes, as environmentally sensitive. When we say 1 unit per acre, do we mean acre of raw land, or do we mean 1 buildable acre?
It follows the same rules as the ordinance in general.
Okay.
I mean, if it's unbuildable, you can't do it.
Okay. I just want to make sure we're not changing the denominator. It's not raw land in this case because it's just a mathematical equation, and in the other case, it's you're dealing with real
Steep slopes,
property
you know,
consideration.
Steep
Yeah.
slopes, watershed.
Yeah. Okay.
So the last provision here is the density transfer charge, or the DTC. There are about 3 dozen programs that I know of throughout the country that allow developers to exceed baseline by choosing between either bringing real, actual TDRs to the table or paying a charge in lieu of actual TDRs. And the advantages of this, the primary advantage in my mind, is that it always assures developers of being able to comply with that, with their ability to exceed baseline. Whether or not they can find, or whether or not they care to find, TDRs by negotiating with sending site property owners. Some other benefits, however, is when you have cash, you can use it as matching funds for grants and so forth. It allows the city to target preservation priorities. There are disadvantages with the DTC. Primary one is that it creates a ceiling for what developers are going to pay for actual TDRs, because logically a developer is not going to pay more for an actual TDR than they'd spend for a legislatively established amount. And of course, that over time, that DTC has to be adjusted to keep up with inflation.
Rick, do you have any examples in the places where they're doing this, where the local government may have become too aggressive in trying to sell in order to maintain a revenue source for some other purpose?
Well, I don't have any examples of that. I have examples where I think the government is pretty happy with it. There's Palm Beach County, Florida, for example, where they when they sell they establish their prices. Actually, they run a TDR bank there, and they're selling TDRs through their bank. But they legislatively set it depending on what the market's doing, and in some years they've made upwards of $10 million selling TDRs. So I haven't heard any downside. I guess probably accusations probably have been made, but I don't know of them.
Okay.
So with that, oh, I forgot to mention, the DTC component is in the code as a mechanism in the proposed code, but it is not activated. And the idea is that I sense that there's a preference to see if the private market will work before going to the DTC. However, if in fact developers can demonstrate that they're really having problems, then the city council could consider that as an option, and they could activate it basically by setting that DTC. So with that, I'm sure you have questions or comments.
One question that I guess I've always had is where and how we came to the square footages that are in here. And I think you answered it once before, but if you could answer that again. You know, offices 2250, retail 2250. Why 2250? Why not 2500? Why not 2000?
Mm-hmm. Well, there was a balancing act, and I think that Caleb should feel free to jump in if he wants to.
He started to. He got up out of his chair.
Oh.
He moved.
Well, let me misstate it, and then he can correct me. But I mean, we needed to make sure that entitlements, existing entitlements were satisfied, and yet not give so much away with a large building unit, so that no one needed to that no one needed to buy TDRs in order to exceed baseline. So it was basically a balancing act.
Okay.
Good enough.
And one of the other things you may remember, George, initially we had a lower number,
Right.
1,500. When we got some feedback from property owners, I think they were justified in saying, if I'm zone C1, you're proposing me as T4 open, you're really lowering what I can build at the 1,500, so the 2,250
Right.
puts them pretty much on parity with their current zoning requirement. It also reflects the fact that in Milton, you got some pretty big houses, which are bigger than the base metric of the smart code, which is actually 1,000. So we tried 1,500, we ended up with 2,250.
Okay.
Because again, your average home size is almost 3,000 in this area, a bit more. So when you factor in senior, you factor in townhomes, 2,250 is a good level of parity.
Rick, I know council certainly over time has the latitude to change things like that, but do you have any experience where something like this has been instituted and they found that maybe the 2,250 is wrong, and have, how do you change that after the fact? You can't change it retroactively. You'd have to change it going forward, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's like anything. It's always the prerogative of a city council to change things, and that certainly can happen, and if it's necessary, it should happen.
Yeah.
But you try to hit the target because it's not something you want to encourage.
Sure. Questions for Rick?
I don't have a question for Rick, I just have a general question, and maybe Rick or Caleb can answer. If you look at the plan as drawn that we have in front of us today, you look at the T2 areas are those are sending areas?
Yeah.
And with what we've defined as receiving areas, how do the TDRs that would come from the T2 areas relate to the potential build out of the other?
They're not enough.
They're not enough.
No, not at all.
Okay. Do you have a ratio? Do we have 20%?
Remember that slide that he put up about how many units were short?
Yeah. Oh no, I don't remember that slide. I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
I'm gonna say, when we did do the number, I think it was maybe we're at about 40% of what we need.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Okay. That's actually almost a good thing, because then you've got the incentive to look at connectivity of greenway plans and bike and equestrian and pedestrian trails. You've got some motivation for those folks to think, oh, it's not going to, I won't be affected by it. I won't have a chance to play.
You're gonna have to take advantage of all the TDR in Crabapple, and there's also gonna be a big incentive outside of Crabapple to transfer in, if you got that.
If we were to think about other areas like Deerfield as an example, I mean, this Crabapple area kind of lends itself because you got a receiving area that is residential, a sending area that's residential. If you think about Deerfield, you don't have that luxury, right?
No, not at all.
So would that alter the scope, not scope, would that alter the mechanics of the program if the sending area was commercial? You'd still be going from just low to high, right? It wouldn't really alter anything?
If the sending area was commercial.
Mm-hmm. Commercial, but a lower zone commercial, in
Well,
order to get higher density in a different area, a different part.
We're assuming that there are commercially zoned areas that the city would want to preserve?
Correct.
Okay. No, I think we need to look at the...
Or an area that the city may want to turn into a green space within a commercial district by allowing that developer to go over here and with an infill kind of a thing and build the new over there as opposed to rebuilding on the same site.
Right. It's conceivable that when you look at the value of those properties, you may have to have a higher allocation rate in those areas.
Okay.
Otherwise, no one's going to play.
Right.
For short of TDRs in, let's say, in Crabapple for development,
Sure, sending.
of receiving, of sending.
Sending.
And we go out to Milton, and could conceivably all the TDRs in the city be put into Crabapple without any mechanism to stop it?
Well,
No, there's always a
market won't allow
maximum
it.
density. So even if you're using TDRs, you cannot exceed the maximum density.
If we're short 400, to say TDRs in Crabapple, about how many are potentially in Milton of sending TDRs? I mean, I don't know. I mean, how many acres?
Theoretically,
are available to do that?
there would be.
Thousands if you don't have any, if not thousands, but certainly hundreds and hundreds, because if you just think about the connectivity on the bike and pedestrian trail alone, and if you just acquire that 1 acre at a time, and it's going to be, say it's 40 miles of linear.
but you're thinking about only the public access side of it, right?
Yes, I am, right?
Yeah,
Just
okay.
for the sake of the example, I know
Yeah.
that there's more, but for the sake of the example, it's kind of easier to see that.
I know that there's that much land out there that could possibly qualify then.
There's a whole bunch,
Okay.
yeah.
But bear in mind, the Crabapple is under no obligation to, at any point, exceed that maximum density
Right.
just to accept more TDRs. I mean, it's capped at
Yeah,
that
if it's
maximum.
capped at 9
Right, but then there's.
units, it's 9 units, no matter how many TDRs you have.
But I,
But then there's other development plans for the city. If you look at,
Yeah.
if you do a master plan for Arnold Mill, or you do, another you do the LCI project that we saw the other day, where you've got some Highway 9 stuff
Yeah.
with where there may be a connectivity at McFarland to 400. This all comes into play for that too.
but to Mark's point, I mean, Mark theoretically could offer his own house and his own lot, right? But he can't offer it for public access because it's
Right.
got a house on it.
Right.
So if you had a piece of property right next door that had nothing on it, you could theoretically offer it, but I'm not sure who would want to buy it.
Yeah.
Well, I think that Caleb was asking how many acres of AG1 do we have? I mean, we have a huge number. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of platted subdivisions, but there's still a fair amount of undeveloped land, whether they're
Right.
3-acre parcels or 10-acre parcels or whatever.
Right.
I mean, the well is fairly deep, I believe, and the more that you transfer those development rights, the more you're going to preserve that, more rural setting versus, and you're enticing people to, instead of selling to developers to develop 1-acre lots, you can.
I'm quoting strictly from memory, but what I remember from the financial model we worked on was somewhere in the order of about 2,600 acres of undeveloped, unplatted AG1 property.
When you need, if we're conservative and we have a 400 building unit discrepancy, you only need
200,
200 acres. So we've got 13 times as much.
right.
Generally,
Public spaces.
Generally, what percentage of the population would participate in something like this?
I think that a property owner really has to want to do this first, and then the money is an additional inducement. So for people who want to participate, you probably know the community better than I do. There's some communities that have, because it's a slightly more, considerably more restrictive environment, where they've gotten 80% of the property owners participating over the course of 30 years. In most cases, it's a much lower fraction. It's 10, 20%.
But it's mostly, you're saying it's mostly a push, not a pull. I mean, mostly the property owners putting it out there that initiate it, not somebody coming and knocking on your door and say, hey, how'd you like it?
Give me a T-cents, I'll be.
Well, I mean, what I meant by that was that I don't think that that money is necessarily the only motivation. I think you've got a lot of the participants tend to be property owners who have a preservation desire to begin with, and this is sort of like that additional incentive that they need.
Think about, if you just take, how does the city begin to plan for parkland that if we can't afford it? You know, for example, that there's a willing participant over on Lackey Road they would love to have his land considered for parkland.
Right.
He's got what, 180 acres to
Yeah.
potentially put into play.
Yeah.
So there's 180 acres of your 200 that you're looking for TDRs.
Yeah, except that, you know, by the same token as you can't buy the land, you can't buy the TDRs either.
Right. Right.
I mean,
No, but you know where to send the developer,
yeah, oh yeah, absolutely.
and then that helps that plan come together.
Yeah. Any other questions for Rick or Caleb? Thank you, guys, very much.
I understand it better
That's terrific.
every time I hear it.
Yeah. George, what's at the intersection of Green and Arnoldville?
What is?
What's over there right now?
Nothing,
Nothing?
Is it undeveloped?
nothing.
Yeah.
Undeveloped.
You're talking about
Both corners.
which end of Green and Arnold?
Well,
I mean,
right here where it's
there's nothing there. I mean, you pull in there to get into that development from the back, kind of.
So is,
But
so my
there's nothing
question
right on the
is it
corner.
appropriate for us to identify, I mean, I'm assuming dark purple is kind of a higher.
Dark purple came out of the comp plan.
Okay.
That's the
So that's,
comp plan
but this
that
is,
we.
the reason I'm asking
that's ours.
is it really, have we, you know, with the prospect of a master plan for Arnold Mill,
Right.
is this consistent or is it premature?
It's consistent with our vision of that.
Yeah,
yes.
okay.
Yeah.
That answers my question.
That's why I say that one was easy, but I don't know about these others that we don't know
Yeah.
about.
We've got, you know, it's 20 minutes to 10. We've got two things theoretically left to talk about, one of which is on the agenda, and that's the code enforcement. There's no time schedule on that, so we can certainly defer that again. My preference would be to do that and ask Robin to just spend maybe 10 or 15 minutes talking about the historic preservation ordinance and what happened last night.
I
And
move we
then
defer the
adjourn.
code enforcement matrix
Second.
till the next meeting.
Second.
All those in
We got 4
favor?
seconds.
Are we gonna go on to the next topic?
Yes.
No, we just
We just
deferred
We
it.
just deferred it.
Okay,
Well, we are going to talk about the historic preservation.
so you have it in your hands, so you
Right.
can.
Yes.
No, we want you to tell us what happened last night, because we weren't, a couple of us were there, but we want to, the implications of what happened last night, I guess.
So basically, before you, I gave you the version that they approved, both the red lines and the clean version. And after our meeting on the 10th of April, we took a lot of your ideas, and we did actually incorporate some of them that were more housekeeping, and we didn't see things or whatever that we felt like would be appropriate. So those, I didn't save myself a set, but I think there might be an extra one up there. But those items are highlighted in gray, I believe, on the red line, that should be, that came out of the meeting that you all suggested things. But then there were other items that staff felt that was not consistent with what the state had requested, and so those were not included. And so we explained that to the city council at the work session.
How were those particular changes presented to them?
They had another version. I didn't make a copy of the version, but there was the PC version that showed all your suggestions, and they
Okay.
saw that.
Okay,
So there was a lot of discussion at the work session a week ago. But in the end, it was suggested by Karen Thurman that there were a lot of council members that were empathetic and felt like that you all had some really good input in trying to, as Ken Gerard said, Miltonize historic preservation ordinance. But in the end, obviously, there were some people in council who felt like that they really wanted to approve something. And so that's when Karen suggested, let's go ahead and approve it per staff recommendations with some of your suggestions that were reflected in gray. And that staff go ahead and send your version, the planning commission in total, all of the suggestions that you made to the state and ask them, what would this do? If as far as there were the minor changes and there were the major changes as far as the powers of the HPC and the variance issue.
I didn't hear anybody suggest that our stuff was gonna go anywhere.
Oh, no, they do. Their intent, in fact, Angela's already sent or communicated with Lee Burns at the state with the PC version that includes everything that you all said.
Right.
For them to evaluate it, to say, what would this do to the ordinance? Would you recognize this ordinance with these changes, especially with the issues with the powers? And last night when they voted, at the end of the discussion was, and that's in part, I think, why it was a split vote 4-3, was that I think there are council members who are very supportive of the changes that you made, and that they were willing to go with that, I assume. But at the same time, the motion that was approved was to approve the staff recommendation, but also at the same time, please go ahead and forward those issues and that version of yours to the state to get their response from. And then let's amend things as we go.
And if the reality is that those things are gonna go, the planning commission recommendations are gonna go
Go where?
to the state.
Yes, in fact, there are.
I feel very differently about it, but I did not hear that last night.
Well, if you listen to the work session, that was the end of the conversation, but I do believe that
The work
there
session
were-
or the council meeting last night?
Huh?
The work session or the meeting
Well, I'm
last
talking
night?
about both. By the end of the work session a week ago, that was the conclusion. That was Karen's suggestion, hey, you guys have a lot of great ideas, but her position was we need something now, but we're not just saying no. We're saying, hey, we want to consider these, but we also want to have an approved ordinance. So we're going to approve this, but we're also going to send the suggestions in the version that the planning commission recommended to the state to get their input to say, what is it? What's going to tip it? What is it going to take, to have an approved ordinance or a blessed ordinance from the state? If we add A, B, C, and D from the planning commission, it's going to tip it. So it can't.
Isn't there an implicit assumption, unless I misunderstood you, that what was approved last night is acceptable to the state?
It is. And now I will say that I think we got advice from the city attorney, what we felt like was the minor tweaks that you guys said. I mean, I think they're more housekeeping issues that we felt that the state wouldn't have issues with. Well, let's
Right.
hope that.
But Ken was pretty vocal on the fact that he didn't feel some of those changes, even if without sending them down there, would be accepted in the courts if there was a lawsuit.
Exactly. But I'm just, you're correct.
I mean, he was very emphatic that I understand that it was going to be sent down there, but
Right, but we're trying, this is what we saw the instruction from the city council, but you're right, there are things that could be make it or break it deals. But we're saying that we're gonna go ahead and, present it to them and say, what about this?
but
But it's not gonna be codified yet, what was approved last night is what's before you, and it does not include a lot of the issues that you all changed the power from the HBC to the council. Those were not included. But there's some, and at the same time, there's some implicit things too, there's a lot of things they probably would never do, and if they did, they'd still probably need the blessing of the city council. I mean, you can't just go and arbitrarily buy, buy land.
That's what it says they
So-
can
It's
do.
not set up to do that right now.
So you just said something I'd never heard before, because if Ken's point of view is that there were things in what we had recommended that would not be substantiated in court or upheld in court, that's a different issue than we don't comply with the state's ordinance.
I don't
Because
know
that was always discussed as a funding issue.
Right, but I don't think it's so much the funding issue as I think his argument was if we went ahead and approved something that wasn't blessed by the state, I'm not saying they're all your suggestions, but it was inconsistent with the state, enabling
those two
that it would
points.
be hard to defend that ordinance, if we were ever
Yeah, well,
sued, because
I'd
it was
love
not
to have that
saying,
argument.
okay.
I'd love to have that argument with him, because everything that we recommended is going the other way.
Right.
Well,
If
I
you-
mean, that's a matter of opinion, and that's his opinion based on, his statements. So
Yeah, understand.
But I do want to encourage you that I do believe that council was sympathetic. I mean, whether you heard it that way or not, Paul, I mean, that's how staff heard it was, okay,
I'm thrilled if that's the case. If
Yeah,
you
it
guys
is
heard
the
it, that you're
case.
sending on the stuff from the planning commission to the state, terrific. I just didn't hear that.
No,
No,
I
it
heard,
is.
I heard that.
Okay.
My-
All I
my-
heard was
but I
that
was-
what we
I
were
was
sending,
sarcastic to that, to the point if the council approves it, but we say, well, but here's some other things, do you think this would work? Why in the world, what would move the state to say, oh, yeah, those are okay?
I'm not
Because
saying
they're
they
all-
would or wouldn't, but I'm just saying. that
You
that's
did
the-
your job of sending it, I understand that, but I said, opening sarcastic. I would see no reason why, after the council approved it, they would say
Yeah.
anything.
Well,
but
we're
that's just-
asking them to, and, I mean, I think that,
Yeah, what bothers me more about what I just heard, though, is the implicit assumption that what was approved is gonna be acceptable with the state without the state looking at it.
well, I will say, no,
Correct.
let me say that what they saw was the same thing, except for those minor changes that were made based on recommendations from you that we felt like as staff were
When you say the
good.
same thing as what?
Okay. What you all saw at your last planning commission meeting was the version that was acceptable and blessed by the state.
Well, we don't know that. I mean, we brought that up at the last meeting, because Angela only gave us half of what came from the state, so we don't know that.
Well, that's,
I mean, yeah, I'm not saying anybody's is misrepresenting it, but she only gave us half of the feedback from the state. That came up in the last meeting, because the document she gave us that came from the state didn't have some of the changes that were made in the actual ordinance itself. And she said, oh, I forgot to give you another letter that we got from the state. So we never saw the other half of that. So we're taking it on faith that what was presented to us last time was something the state had blessed. So if that's what you're saying, then I mean, if the state had truly blessed what was approved last night, except for quote-unquote minor tweaks, then I guess it's a good implicit assumption to make that.
I mean, that's what staff is making that assumption, and
Okay.
we're, you know, based on the information that we were given, and that we translated into it, as well as the city attorney making their, I think the city attorney made their changes, and then we,
remember one of the biggest arguments was, you can't do it that way because that's just not how it's done.
Yeah, I know.
Remember, that's one of the big arguments that we were dealing with.
Yeah.
That's the most ridiculous argument you can give.
Pardon?
That's the most ridiculous
Yeah.
argument you can give.
It's like they're saying just because.
Because
Robin, did you say that the version that was sent to the state did not include our changes on the powers?
No.
well, those
It
didn't
did
come up
not.
until after the fact, I believe.
To answer your question, no, that was
Wait.
not included.
You mean just now that we sent to the state? That this, your version with all the suggestions of the powers and the variance, we've asked the state to look at right now.
But that's not what was approved
But
last
that's
night.
not what was approved, that's correct. What was approved was a staff recommendation with a few of the minor changes that are reflected in Greg's.
I'd have to go back and look at the last version, but I mean, the one thing I noted right away, because I was looking for it, is that one of the things that was deleted is that a historic district no longer has to have a historic property in it.
Oh,
Correct.
So,
but remember, we are merely a recommending body.
yes, that's
To
right.
vote-
Yes,
to
and
vote.
our changes are minor.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
All right.
Any other questions about the historic preservation ordinance? When do
Questions or
you
comments?
expect feedback from the state? Any idea?
Well, Angela just heard today that Lee Burns, who's the main contact, won't be back in the office till the 1st, so.
Okay.
so
So sometime in May, maybe?
maybe.
Okay.
I
Do
move
we
we,
need another meeting?
Yeah, we need to set up
yeah.
a special
Dave.
meeting, I think a work session to talk, or a special call meeting. We don't need a special call meeting, we're just a work session, right?
I wouldn't know, yeah, a work
I mean,
session.
we're not gonna be voting on anything, so
Discuss
a
it,
work
so-
session to talk about the form-based code ordinance. So, our next meeting, our next official planning commission meeting is on the 22nd, correct?
Correct, yes.
22nd?
I believe so.
I can tell you 1 second.
Yes, it is, fourth Tuesday.
Yeah.
So if we're trying to stick to Tuesdays, I can't do it on the 8th, but I could do it on the 1st or the 15th.
I can't do it the first because I'll be in California.
Well, that's,
I'm sorry, say that again.
Does it need to be, first, does it need to be a Tuesday, or do we want it to be a Tuesday?
Tuesdays work, or
Tuesdays
Wednesdays
work.
work for me, but
Joe, Tuesday work for you?
Tuesday works.
Mark?
Tuesday.
So how about the 15th?
be okay with me.
Good for me.
Okay.
hang on 1 second. Yep, works for me.
So 15th.
Is that okay?
Bless you.
God bless you.
Thank you.
So what time do you want to make it?
Want to start at 6?
Sure.
Sure.
Good.
Okay. The expectation, I know, in order to keep it on plan, is that we would recommend, in whatever form we do, but we would recommend at our May 22nd meeting that be passed on to council for their meeting in June, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Okay. Is there anything on the agenda for May at this point?
Oh, yes.
That's what I was afraid of.
We have 3 rezonings.
Okay.
Well, but if we,
We probably ought to plan part of this 15th to be a briefing then.
Well, I won't have that read. It won't, well, the 15th to the 22nd, I mean, I guess.
Well,
We can have a general briefing.
yeah, I don't
may
mean
not
to
have
give
it.
us the whole packet, but I mean, at least make us aware of what they are so we can have some time to look at them and think
Sure,
about them.
that's fine.
Yeah.
but also, George, by the 15th, we've had the chance to go through all these. We could go through it, everybody kind of agree, yeah, or we could move through it rapidly, couldn't we, on the 22nd?
Robin, what would you suggest with this ordinance? So, I mean, it's not really a good use of everybody's time to do a page flip for typos and,
Do you want to do it like what you did with the LCIs, just, get to me your comments?
we can do that.
Did you feel like that was,
It worked for me.
Worked for me, but I understood it a little better, but
Well,
it does take a
There's
while
a-
to get used to.
well, one of my questions and one of my concerns is with the architectural requirements that are in this thing. I think, that how we're going to handle that, I'm not sure.
It's a
Well,
great question.
yeah, and we wanted to have Lou here,
And
so
we-
that could drag it out.
I'll ask about that tomorrow. I'll try to make some.
If he can't make it on the 15th, see if he can get 2 other dates that he can make it, and we'll see if something works. Because I agree with Gariel, I think it would be a good idea to have
Well, we
him here.
brought up
Yeah.
half a dozen.
Yeah,
I mean, they seem to be rather restrictive, and that's not overly restrictive, actually.
yeah. Well, plus I'm not sure we want one person to define what we want Milton to look like, or at least Crab Apple to look like going forward.
Yes.
We can call it Oliverville or something.
Yeah. I'll definitely be interested in what Joe's input is on that.
Well, I mean, I think Joe, that's a great question. I love
Yeah.
the old blind dog building, and
I do
if-
too.
If that's
I-
precluded, then we got a problem.
Yeah.
I like the design of that layout
Many-
there. I
That's
think it
what
looks good.
That's the one that
Caleb-
makes Lou have heartache.
Yeah,
He's
but
not
Caleb
like-
also
he
threw in,
doesn't-
I'm sorry.
Well, that's tough luck.
Caleb also said on the word front, well, not storefront, but the other, something else.
Shop front.
Shop front. He said glass, and nowhere in there, and I wanted to say something I thought was, wait, doesn't mention glass at all. He
He's
said
probably-
glazing.
He's probably afraid we start talking about signs.
Well, that's.
Only one.
But I was
sign,
thinking
only one.
about that.
No freestanding
No,
signs.
it's just going back
in,
to
in the first zone.
the rest.
Okay, we're all getting punchy here.
Yeah.
We need a meeting to adjourn, I mean, a motion to adjourn.
I make a motion we adjourn.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Anybody opposed?
They are.